My name is Lauren Hayes, and the morning I walked into what I thought would be my dream job interview, I had no idea my own parents had already called ahead to destroy my chances. They told the hiring panel I had a criminal record, that I was unstable, that hiring me would be the company's biggest mistake. What they didn't know was that in exactly 37 days I would be sitting across from them as their new boss, watching their faces drain of color as the family lawyer read my grandmother's will aloud. Sometimes the people who try to bury you don't realize they're just planting seeds. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The rain was hammering against the windows of the Meridian Tech building that Tuesday morning, each drop sounding like tiny bullets against the glass. I stood in the marble lobby, smoothing down my navy blazer for the third time, and checking my reflection in the polished surface of the elevator doors. 28 years old, fresh out of my MBA program, and finally ready to prove that all those late nights studying while working 2 part-time jobs had been worth it. The senior marketing director position at Meridian Tech wasn't just a job, it was validation. It was my chance to step out of my family's shadow and build something entirely my own. I'd researched everything about this company. Founded in 2018, they'd grown from a small startup to a major player in software consulting, landing contracts with Fortune 500 companies across the Pacific Northwest. Their marketing department was expanding rapidly, and they needed someone who understood both traditional marketing strategies and the digital landscape. I knew I was perfect for this role. My portfolio was solid, my references were glowing, and I'd even done a case study on their competitors during my final semester, just because I was genuinely fascinated by their market position. The elevator chimed softly as it reached the 15th floor. The receptionist, a woman in her early 30s with kind eyes and a warm smile, looked up from her computer screen. "You must be Lauren Hayes," she said, her voice carrying a slight note of something I couldn't quite identify. "They're ready for you in conference room A." "Thank you," I replied, following her down a hallway lined with floor-to-ceiling windows that offered a stunning view of the Willamette River. The office space was everything I'd hoped for. Modern, collaborative, filled with the kind of creative energy that made you want to roll up your sleeves and dive into challenging projects. Young professionals moved purposefully between workstations, their conversations a mixture of technical jargon and excited brainstorming. This was where I belonged. Conference room A was spacious but not intimidating, with a long wooden table surrounded by ergonomic chairs and a wall-mounted screen displaying the Meridian Tech logo. 3 people sat waiting for me, and I recognized them immediately from my research. David Chen, the HR director, was a soft-spoken man in his 40s who'd built his reputation on finding exceptional talent. Patricia Williams, the CEO, was known for her direct communication style and her ability to spot potential in unconventional candidates. James Rodriguez, the legal counsel, served as an advisor on major hiring decisions, particularly for senior positions. "Lauren, please have a seat," David said, gesturing to the chair across from them. His tone was professional but noticeably cooler than I'd expected from our phone conversations. "We appreciate you taking the time to come in today." I settled into the chair, pulling out my portfolio and placing it on the table. "Thank you for the opportunity. I'm really excited to discuss how I can contribute to Meridian Tech's continued growth." Patricia leaned back in her chair, studying me with an expression that seemed more guarded than curious. "We've reviewed your resume and your academic credentials. Impressive work at Portland State, and your internship at Creative Solutions shows promise." She paused, exchanging a glance with David that made my stomach tighten slightly. "However, we've received some additional information about your background that we need to address." The words hit me like ice water. Additional information? I'd been completely transparent about everything in my application, my work history, my education, even the semester I'd taken off to care for my grandmother during her final illness. "I'm not sure what you mean," I said carefully. "Everything in my application is accurate and complete." James opened a manila folder that had been sitting closed on the table. "We received a phone call yesterday from someone claiming to be a family member. They expressed serious concerns about your character and reliability." He pulled out a handwritten note. "According to this source, you have a history of theft, you've struggled with substance abuse issues, and you've been involved in several incidents that resulted in criminal charges." My mouth went dry. The fluorescent lights suddenly seemed too bright, and I could hear my heartbeat in my ears. "That's completely false," I managed to say, my voice steadier than I felt. "I have never been arrested, never charged with any crime, and I certainly don't have substance abuse issues. I don't understand who would tell you that, but they're lying." David's expression softened slightly, but I could see the doubt in his eyes. "The caller seemed very knowledgeable about your personal life. They mentioned specific details: where you went to high school, your grandmother's recent passing, even your current address. It wasn't some random person making false accusations." The room felt like it was shrinking around me. Someone who knew intimate details about my life had deliberately sabotaged this interview. Someone who wanted to see me fail. "Did they give you their name?" I asked, though part of me already suspected the answer. Patricia nodded grimly. "They identified themselves as your parents, Richard and Victoria Hayes. They said they felt morally obligated to warn us before we made what they called a serious mistake." The betrayal hit me like a physical blow. My own parents had called ahead to destroy my chances at this job. My mother and father, who had raised me, who claimed to love me, had picked up the phone and told outright lies to ensure I wouldn't succeed. I gripped the edge of the table, trying to process what I was hearing. "They also mentioned," James continued, consulting his notes, "that you have a pattern of unstable behavior, that you've been estranged from the family due to your actions, and that hiring you would expose the company to significant liability risks." I closed my eyes for a moment, trying to center myself. When I opened them, all three interviewers were watching me with expressions that ranged from concerned to skeptical. "I can provide you with a complete background check," I said quietly. "You can contact the FBI, the state police, anyone you want. You'll find that I have never been arrested, never been charged with anything, never even received a speeding ticket. I can also provide you with drug test results, character references from professors and employers, and any other documentation you need to verify my character." David leaned forward. "Why would your parents say these things if they weren't true?" That was the question I couldn't answer, at least not honestly. Because the truth was complicated and painful and rooted in years of family dynamics that I was only beginning to understand. The truth was that my parents had spent my entire life positioning my older brother Brandon as the golden child, while treating me like an inconvenience. The truth was that they saw my success as a threat to their carefully constructed narrative about which of their children deserved their support and investment. "I don't know," I said instead, "but I can prove that what they told you is false." Patricia exchanged another look with her colleagues. "Lauren, I have to be honest with you. Even if we could verify that the criminal allegations are untrue, the fact that your own parents would make such serious accusations raises red flags about family stability and potential workplace conflicts. We need employees who can focus on their responsibilities without external drama affecting their performance." "I understand your concerns," I replied, fighting to keep my voice professional. "But I would ask you to judge me based on my qualifications, my work history, and my potential contributions to your company, not on family dysfunction that I had no part in creating." The interview continued for another 20 minutes, but I could tell that the damage was irreparable. They asked perfunctory questions about my marketing experience and my strategic vision for their department. But their enthusiasm had evaporated. They were going through the motions, probably already deciding how to phrase the rejection email. When David finally stood and thanked me for my time, his handshake was brief and impersonal. I walked back through that beautiful office space, past the creative energy and collaborative atmosphere that I'd been so excited to join, and knew that I'd never see it again as an employee. The receptionist's earlier expression made sense now. She'd probably overheard David discussing the situation with his colleagues. By the time I reached the lobby, I felt like I was moving through water, each step requiring enormous effort. The rain had intensified while I was upstairs, and I stood under the building's awning for several minutes, watching water cascade down the street. My phone buzzed with a text message from my mother. "Hope your interview went well, sweetheart. Can't wait to hear all about it." The casual cruelty of it made my hands shake. She was sitting somewhere, probably in her pristine kitchen with its granite countertops and fresh flowers, pretending she hadn't just destroyed my career prospects an hour earlier. I called an Uber instead of walking to my car, not trusting myself to drive safely in my current state. During the ride back to my apartment in the Pearl District, I stared out the window at the city I'd grown up in, wondering how many other opportunities my parents had quietly sabotaged over the years. How many times had I been passed over for something and assumed it was just bad luck, or insufficient qualifications? My apartment was a modest one-bedroom on the third floor of a converted warehouse. Nothing fancy but mine, in a way that my childhood home had never been. I kicked off my heels, hung my blazer carefully in the closet, and sat on my couch in my interview clothes, trying to figure out what to do next. The logical part of my brain kept insisting that this had to be some kind of misunderstanding, that there was an explanation that didn't involve my parents deliberately trying to ruin my life. But the emotional part of me, the part that had absorbed years of subtle put-downs and comparisons to my brother, recognized this as an escalation of a pattern that had been going on for decades. My phone rang, and for a moment I hoped it might be David Chen calling to say they'd reconsidered, that they wanted to give me a chance to prove myself.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
Instead, it was my brother Brandon, calling from his corner office at Hayes & Associates, the marketing firm my parents had built, and where he served as creative director, despite having no formal marketing education or relevant experience outside of what they'd handed him. "Hey, Lauren." His voice was carefully neutral. "Mom mentioned you had an interview today. How'd it go?" "Terribly," I said, too emotionally exhausted to pretend otherwise. "Someone called ahead and told them I had a criminal record." There was a pause that lasted just a beat too long. "That's awful. Who would do something like that? Mom and Dad?" Another pause. "Come on, Lauren. Why would they do that?" "That doesn't make any sense." I could hear the automatic dismissal in his voice, the same tone he'd used when we were kids, and I tried to tell him about the different ways our parents treated us. Brandon had grown up basking in their approval and investment, never questioning why I seemed to struggle for scraps of the same attention. To him, our parents were generous and supportive, because that's exactly what they'd been to him. "It makes perfect sense if you understand that they don't want me to succeed," I replied. "They want me dependent on them, grateful for whatever crumbs they throw my way. They can't stand the idea that I might build something on my own." "That's paranoid thinking, Lauren. Mom and Dad love you. Maybe someone else called pretending to be them, or maybe there was some kind of miscommunication." I almost laughed at how predictable his response was. Brandon had never seen the subtle cruelty, because it had never been directed at him. "Did you know about this, Brandon? Did they tell you they were going to sabotage my interview?" "Of course not. I would never." He stopped himself, and in that pause I heard everything I needed to know. "They did tell you." My voice was flat now, drained of anger. "They told you, and you didn't warn me." "Lauren, it's not like that. They're worried about you, that's all. They think you're making impulsive decisions, trying to move too fast. They love you." "No," I said quietly. "They love the idea of controlling me. There's a difference." I hung up before he could respond and turned off my phone. The apartment felt too quiet, too empty, but I didn't want to talk to anyone else. I changed into comfortable clothes and sat at my kitchen table, staring at the rejection email that had already arrived in my inbox. It was professionally worded, thanking me for my interest and explaining that they'd decided to pursue other candidates whose backgrounds were more aligned with their current needs. That night, I lay awake staring at the ceiling, replaying every word of the interview and trying to understand the full scope of what my parents had done. This wasn't just about one job. They had demonstrated that they were willing to actively sabotage my career to maintain their control over my life. They had shown me exactly how far they were prepared to go to keep me from becoming independent. The next morning, I woke up with a clarity that surprised me. I wasn't going to confront them directly. That would only lead to denials and gaslighting and Brandon's insistence that I was being dramatic. Instead, I was going to do what I should have done years ago. I was going to start paying attention, really paying attention, to their words, their actions, their patterns of behavior. I was going to document everything, because somewhere deep down, I had a feeling that this Meridian Tech situation was just the beginning. I made coffee and opened my laptop, creating a new document titled Family Documentation. I started with everything I could remember about the interview sabotage, including the exact wording of the accusations and the names of everyone who had been in the room. Then I began working backward, documenting every instance I could recall of my parents undermining my goals or treating me differently than Brandon. The list grew longer than I'd expected. The time they'd forgotten to submit my application for the scholarship I'd worked so hard to qualify for. The way they'd dismissed my acceptance to the honors program as not that big a deal, while throwing a party for Brandon when he made the dean's list with much lower grades. The comments about my career choices, my apartment, my independence, that were always framed as concern but felt like criticism. The way they'd excluded me from business discussions at family dinners, while actively soliciting Brandon's opinions on decisions he wasn't qualified to make. As I typed, a pattern emerged that was both undeniable and heartbreaking. My parents had spent years systematically undermining my confidence and opportunities, while presenting themselves as loving and supportive. They had become experts at plausible deniability, always able to frame their sabotage as protection, or their favoritism as simply responding to Brandon's quote, natural talents. By noon, I had filled 8 pages with specific examples, dates, and consequences. I printed out the document and placed it in a folder, the beginning of what I suspected would become a much larger collection. Then I did something I'd never done before. I started researching my own family. It began with simple curiosity about the business my parents had built. Hayes & Associates had a professional website with photos of the team, case studies of successful campaigns, and testimonials from satisfied clients. Brandon featured prominently in the company materials, described as an innovative strategist with an intuitive understanding of consumer psychology. My parents were listed as founders and senior partners. There was no mention of me anywhere, despite the fact that I'd spent summers during high school helping with filing, data entry, and research projects. I dug deeper, searching through business registrations, tax filings, and corporate documents that were part of the public record. What I found surprised me. Hayes & Associates wasn't just a family business, it was struggling. Their client list had shrunk significantly over the past 2 years, and they'd lost several major accounts to more innovative competitors. The financial documents painted a picture of a company that was profitable but stagnant, facing increasing pressure from firms that better understood digital marketing and social media strategy. Then I found something that made me sit back in my chair and stare at the screen. 3 months ago, Hayes & Associates had submitted a proposal for a major consulting contract with Meridian Tech. They'd been competing for the same type of marketing work that I'd been interviewing for, but from an external vendor perspective rather than as an internal employee. According to the public bidding documents, they'd been rejected in favor of building an internal marketing team. My parents hadn't just sabotaged my interview out of general malice or control issues. They'd sabotaged it because my success would have been a direct threat to their business interests. If I'd gotten the job at Meridian Tech and proven myself capable of handling their marketing needs internally, it would have validated the company's decision to reject Hayes & Associates' proposal. More than that, it would have demonstrated that their own daughter could do the work they'd been claiming required their expertise and experience. I felt a cold fury settle in my chest, different from the hurt and confusion I'd experienced the day before. This was calculated. This was business. They had sacrificed my career prospects to protect their own financial interests, and they'd done it without a moment's hesitation. My phone buzzed with another text from my mother. "Haven't heard from you since yesterday. Everything okay?" The fake concern in those words made my stomach turn. She knew exactly why I hadn't called. Instead of responding, I continued my research. I wanted to understand everything about their business situation, their financial pressures, and their competitive position. If they were going to treat this like a business decision, then I was going to arm myself with business intelligence. That evening, I drove to my Aunt Carol's house in the Alberta Arts District. Carol was my father's younger sister, a ceramic artist who had always been the bohemian black sheep of the Hayes family. She'd never married, never had children, and never seemed particularly interested in the kind of conventional success that my parents valued. What she did have was perspective, and a willingness to speak honestly about family dynamics that everyone else preferred to ignore. Carol's house was a small bungalow filled with her pottery, paintings by local artists, and furniture that looked like it had been collected from estate sales over several decades. She answered the door wearing clay-stained jeans and a sweater that had seen better days, her gray hair pulled back in a messy bun. "Lauren, what a nice surprise. Come in, I just made tea." We sat in her living room, surrounded by half-finished ceramic pieces and the smell of sandalwood incense. Carol poured tea from a pot she'd made herself, and I found myself relaxing for the first time in 2 days. "You look troubled," she said without preamble. "What's going on?" I told her everything. The interview, the sabotage, my research into the business situation, the growing documentation of years of undermining behavior. Carol listened without interrupting, occasionally nodding or making small sounds of understanding. When I finished, she was quiet for a long moment. "I wish I could say I was surprised," she finally said. "But your parents have always seen love as a finite resource. In their minds, supporting you somehow diminishes what they can give to Brandon." "But why?" I asked. "Why is it a competition? Why can't they want both of their children to succeed?" Carol sighed, looking older than her 55 years. "Your grandmother Eleanor tried to warn me about this years ago. She said Richard and Victoria were raising Brandon to be their legacy and you to be their insurance policy. Brandon gets the investment and the opportunities because he's supposed to carry on the family business. You get the pressure to stay close and dependent because you're supposed to take care of them when they're old." The words hit me like a slap. Grandmother knew about this? Eleanor saw everything. She watched them favor Brandon and marginalize you, and it broke her heart. She tried to talk to them about it several times, but they always insisted they were treating you both fairly. Carol reached across the coffee table and took my hand. "She left you something, Lauren. Something important. I think it's time you knew about it. My grandmother had died 6 months ago, and I'd been too grief-stricken to pay much attention to the estate details. My parents had handled all the arrangements, telling me only that she'd left small sums to each of her grandchildren, and that the bulk of her estate would go to my father as her only surviving child." "What do you mean she left me something?" Carol smiled, and for the first time since the interview disaster, I felt a flicker of hope. "Eleanor was smarter than any of us gave her credit for. She knew exactly what your parents were doing, and she decided to do something about it. The will reading is next week. Your parents think it's going to be a formality, but Eleanor had other plans." "I don't understand." "You will. Just make sure you're there for the will reading. Don't let them convince you it's not important or that you don't need to attend. Promise me you'll be there." I promised, though I had no idea what I was promising to witness. Carol walked me to the door, giving me a hug that smelled like clay dust and patchouli. "One more thing, Lauren. Your grandmother kept detailed records of her investments and business holdings. She was much wealthier than anyone realized, and much more strategic about how she wanted her wealth distributed. Next week is going to change everything." I drove home through the quiet Portland streets, my mind spinning with questions and possibilities. For the first time since that disastrous interview, I felt something other than anger and hurt. I felt anticipation. That night, I added Carol's revelations to my documentation file and began researching my grandmother's estate. What I found in the public records was surprising. Eleanor Hayes had been far from the quiet widow my parents had portrayed her as. She'd been an active investor, a silent partner in several local businesses, and apparently much more financially sophisticated than anyone in the family had understood. I also found something else: preliminary estate documents that listed me not as a minor beneficiary, but as someone with significant interests in holdings I'd never heard of. The documents were filed with the court but sealed pending the formal will reading, so I couldn't access the details. But the fact that my name appeared at all suggested that Carol was right about next week changing everything. I spent the following days in a strange state of suspended animation. I continued my job search, but half-heartedly, knowing that any other interviews might be subject to the same sabotage. I avoided my parents, calls and texts, not trusting myself to maintain a civil conversation. And I waited for the will reading, counting down the days like a prisoner awaiting parole. The call came on Friday afternoon. Thomas Bennett, my grandmother's lawyer, contacted me directly to confirm my attendance at the will reading the following Tuesday. His tone was formal but not unfriendly, and he mentioned that it was important for all beneficiaries to be present. Will my parents be there? I asked. Yes, as will your brother and several other parties with interests in the estate. It should be a straightforward proceeding. Something in his voice suggested that it would be anything but straightforward, but I didn't press for details. I simply confirmed my attendance and began preparing for what Carol had promised would change everything. That weekend, I bought a new suit, not for a job interview this time, but for whatever transformation was about to occur in my life. I had no idea what my grandmother had planned, but I was ready to find out. After years of being marginalized and undermined, after watching my parents sabotage my career to protect their own interests, I was ready for something to change. The will reading was scheduled for 10 o'clock on Tuesday morning. I arrived early, parking across the street from Thomas Bennett's law office and watching as my family members arrived. My parents pulled up in their silver BMW, both dressed as if they were attending a board meeting. Brandon arrived separately in his red sports car, checking his phone as he walked toward the building. I waited until they were all inside before crossing the street myself. The receptionist directed me to a conference room where my family was already seated around a polished mahogany table. My parents looked up when I entered, their expressions carefully neutral but with an underlying tension I couldn't quite identify. "Lauren," my mother said, her voice artificially warm, "I'm so glad you could make it. I know grandmother would have wanted you here." The irony of her words wasn't lost on me. After years of excluding me from important family matters, they were suddenly concerned about what grandmother would have wanted. I took a seat at the far end of the table, as far from them as possible. Thomas Bennett entered a few minutes later, carrying a thick folder and wearing the kind of serious expression that lawyers reserve for significant occasions. He was a man in his 60s with silver hair and the bearing of someone who had delivered life-changing news many times before. "Thank you all for being here," he began, settling into his chair at the head of the table. "We're here today to read the last will and testament of Eleanor Margaret Hayes, who passed away on March 15th of this year. Before I begin, I want to note that Mrs. Hayes revised her will several times in the months before her death, with the final version being signed and witnessed just 6 weeks before she passed." My father leaned forward slightly. "Revised? She didn't mention any changes to us." Thomas smiled diplomatically. "Mrs. Hayes was very particular about keeping her estate planning private until this moment. She felt it was important that family relationships not be influenced by financial expectations." He opened the folder and withdrew a thick document. "I'll summarize the key provisions, though complete copies will be provided to all beneficiaries." He cleared his throat and began reading. The early portions of the will were exactly what I'd expected. Small bequests to local charities, personal items distributed among family members, and acknowledgments of her gratitude for care received during her final illness. My parents relaxed visibly as Thomas read through these standard provisions. Then came the section that changed everything. "To my beloved granddaughter Lauren Hayes," Thomas read, his voice taking on a more formal tone, "who has demonstrated resilience, integrity, and independence, despite facing challenges that would have defeated a lesser person, I leave the following." He paused, looking around the table to ensure he had everyone's attention. The silence in the room was absolute. "I leave to Lauren Hayes my complete ownership stake in Meridian Tech Solutions, comprising 47% of outstanding shares and representing controlling interest in the company." The words hung in the air like smoke from an explosion. My mother's face went white. My father's mouth opened, but no sound came out. Brandon looked back and forth between them as if he'd missed something crucial. I felt the blood drain from my face as the implications crashed over me. My grandmother hadn't just left me money or property. She'd left me control of the very company where my parents had sabotaged my interview. She'd made me the boss of the people who had rejected me based on their lies. Thomas continued reading, but I barely heard the words. Something about voting rights and board representation and the importance of ethical leadership. All I could focus on was the shocked faces of my family, and the incredible, impossible reality that my grandmother had somehow given me the power to right the wrong they'd committed. When Thomas finished reading, the silence stretched for what felt like hours. Finally, my father found his voice. "That's impossible. Mother never mentioned owning shares in any tech company. She was a retired teacher, not an investor. Thomas pulled out another document. Mrs. Hayes was the original silent partner who provided startup funding for Meridian Tech in 2018. Her investment was structured to remain confidential until her death, at which point her shares would transfer to her chosen heir. Quote, "He looked directly at me. She spent considerable time deciding who should inherit this responsibility." My mother's shock was giving way to anger. "This is outrageous. She never discussed any of this with us. How are we supposed to know this is legitimate?" "I have all the documentation," Thomas replied calmly. "Stock certificates, investment records, correspondence with the company's founders. Everything has been properly maintained and legally verified." Brandon finally spoke, his voice shaky. "Lauren, you can't possibly know how to run a company like that. Maybe we should all discuss this as a family, figure out the best way to handle." No, the word came out stronger than I'd intended. I stood up, feeling steadier on my feet than I had in days. "There's nothing to discuss. Grandmother left this to me, and I intend to honor her decision." My father's face was red now. "Lauren, be reasonable. You don't have any business experience. You'd be in over your head from day one. The responsible thing would be to sell the shares or transfer them to someone who knows what they're doing." "Someone like you?" I asked, my voice deadly quiet. "Someone who would sabotage their own daughter's job interview to protect their business interests?" The accusation hung in the air like a challenge. My mother's guilty expression told me everything I needed to know about whether they'd really thought their sabotage would remain secret forever. "I don't know what you're talking about," my father said, but his voice lacked conviction. I pulled out my phone and opened the documentation I'd been compiling. "I'm talking about the phone call you made to David Chen at Meridian Tech, telling him I had a criminal record. I'm talking about the lies you told to ensure I wouldn't get the senior marketing director position. I'm talking about the fact that you'd rather destroy my career than risk me succeeding at a company where you'd been rejected as vendors." My mother tried to speak, but I continued. "I know about Hayes & Associates losing the Meridian Tech contract. I know about your declining client base and your financial pressures. I know you saw my potential success as a threat to your business, so you eliminated the threat." Thomas Bennett watched this family confrontation with the professional detachment of someone who'd seen many estate distributions trigger long simmering conflicts. He cleared his throat gently. "Perhaps we should focus on the practical matters at hand. Lauren, as the majority shareholder, you'll need to schedule a meeting with Meridian Tech's current board of directors. There are also several other provisions in your grandmother's will that we need to discuss." I sat back down, trying to process the magnitude of what had just happened. In the space of 30 minutes, I'd gone from unemployed victim of family sabotage to majority owner of a successful tech company. More than that, I was now in a position to address the wrong that had been done to me, but from a position of power rather than victimhood. "What other provisions?" I asked. Thomas smiled, and I caught a glimpse of what might have been satisfaction in his expression. "Your grandmother also left detailed instructions about her expectations for how Meridian Tech should be managed. She was particularly interested in ensuring that the company maintained high ethical standards in all its business dealings." He pulled out another folder. "She also left a personal letter for you, to be opened after the formal will reading." The letter was in my grandmother's careful handwriting, sealed in an envelope with my name written in her distinctive script. I opened it with shaking hands while my family watched in stunned silence. "My dearest Lauren," it began. "If you are reading this, then you now understand that love and business can be two very different things. I have watched your parents treat you as less worthy of investment and opportunity than your brother, and I decided that actions speak louder than their words about family values." I looked up at my parents, whose faces had gone from shock to something approaching panic. They were beginning to understand that this wasn't just about money, it was about accountability. The letter continued. "Meridian Tech represents the future of ethical business practices. I invested in them not just for financial returns, but because I believed in their commitment to merit-based decision-making and transparent operations. I am leaving this responsibility to you because I trust you to uphold these values, even when, especially when, it means confronting those who have wronged you." My hands were trembling as I read the final paragraph. The people who sabotaged your interview made a tactical error. They assumed that destroying your opportunity would eliminate the threat you represented to their comfortable mediocrity. They never imagined that you might return as their superior, armed with the power to demand the ethical standards they refuse to maintain. Use this power wisely, but use it decisively. Love, Grandmother Eleanor. I folded the letter carefully and placed it back in the envelope. When I looked up, my family was staring at me with expressions ranging from fear to disbelief. She knew, my mother whispered. She knew what we did. She knew everything, I replied. The question now is what we're going to do about it. Thomas Bennett gathered his papers while my family sat in stunned silence, the weight of my grandmother's final revelation settling over the room like fog. The conference room that had felt spacious when I'd entered now seemed to shrink around us, the mahogany table becoming a chasm between my old life and whatever came next. Lauren, Thomas said, his voice cutting through the tension, I'll need to schedule a time with you this week to go over the transition procedures. There are board meetings to arrange, legal documents to transfer, and several operational matters that require immediate attention. I nodded, still clutching my grandmother's letter. What about the current management structure at Meridian Tech? Do they know about this change in ownership? They know that Mrs. Hayes was the silent partner, but they don't yet know about the inheritance transfer. You'll need to introduce yourself to the board formally. He paused, glancing at my parents who remained frozen in their chairs. Given the circumstances surrounding your recent interview experience, I imagine this will be a rather interesting conversation. My father finally found his voice, though it came out as little more than a croak. Lauren, you have to understand, we never meant for things to go this far. The phone call to Meridian Tech was just a moment of poor judgment. We were worried about you moving too fast, taking on responsibilities you might not be ready for. The rationalization was so perfectly crafted, so utterly predictable, that I almost smiled. Even faced with the consequences of their sabotage, they couldn't bring themselves to admit the truth about their motivations. They were still trying to frame their betrayal as parental concern. Poor judgment, I repeated, letting the words hang in the air. You systematically destroyed my professional reputation to protect your own business interests, and you're calling it poor judgment. My mother leaned forward, her perfectly applied makeup doing nothing to hide the panic in her eyes. Sweetheart, we can work through this as a family. Maybe there's a way for Hayes and Associates to partner with Meridian Tech, to build something together that benefits everyone. The audacity of it took my breath away. Even now, even knowing that I held controlling interest in the company they'd been rejected by, they were angling for a way to profit from the situation. They couldn't conceive of a world where their actions might have consequences that couldn't be negotiated away. I stood up, smoothing down my skirt and gathering my copy of the will documents. Thomas, please schedule that meeting for tomorrow morning if possible. I'd like to address the Meridian Tech situation as quickly as we can arrange it. Of course. I'll call Patricia Williams this afternoon. Brandon had been quiet throughout most of the proceedings, but now he looked up at me with an expression I couldn't quite read. Lauren, wait. Before you do anything drastic, maybe we should talk privately. Just the two of us, without all the legal formalities. I paused at the door, considering his request. Part of me was curious about what he might say, whether he'd finally acknowledge the years of differential treatment or continue to minimize the impact of our parents' favoritism. But a larger part of me was simply exhausted by the prospect of another conversation, where I'd be asked to understand, to forgive, to make allowances for behavior that had caused me genuine harm. I don't think we have anything to discuss right now, Brandon. You've had plenty of opportunities over the years to address the way our parents treated me differently. You chose to stay silent then, and your silence benefited you. I'm not interested in hearing your thoughts now that the power dynamic has shifted. I left the conference room without looking back, walking through Thomas Bennett's tastefully decorated law office with a strange sense of detachment. Everything looked exactly the same as it had an hour ago, but I felt like a completely different person. The woman who had entered that room had been a victim of family sabotage, unemployed and uncertain about her future. The woman leaving was the majority owner of a successful technology company, armed with both the power and the moral authority to demand accountability. The Portland afternoon was crisp and clear, with the kind of autumn sunshine that made the city look like a postcard. I sat in my car for several minutes, not yet ready to drive, trying to process the magnitude of what had just occurred. My phone buzzed with a text from Aunt Carol. "How did it go? Call me when you're ready to talk." Instead of calling, I drove directly to her house. Carol was in her backyard studio, working on a large ceramic piece that looked like it might become a fountain or garden sculpture. Her hands were covered in clay, and she looked up at me with expectant eyes. "Well?" she asked, not bothering with small talk. She left me Meridian Tech, controlling interest. 47%. Carol's face broke into a grin that transformed her entire appearance. I knew it. Eleanor was planning something big, but she wouldn't tell me the details. She just kept saying that you were going to be fine, that justice had a way of working itself out if you were patient enough. I sank into one of the mismatched chairs scattered around her studio. "Carol, I don't know anything about running a tech company. What if I mess this up? What if grandmother was wrong about my ability to handle this kind of responsibility?" "Are you kidding me?" Carol wiped her hands on a towel and sat down across from me. "You have an MBA in marketing, you've been researching this company for months, and you understand their business model better than most of their current employees. More importantly, you have something that money can't buy: moral clarity about what's right and what's wrong." She reached over and took my hands, leaving small smudges of clay on my palms. "Your parents have spent your entire life trying to convince you that you're not capable, not worthy, not ready for real responsibility. They did it to keep you dependent on them, to maintain control over your choices and your future. But Eleanor saw through all of that. She saw who you really are, and she trusted you with something that meant everything to her. What if the board doesn't accept me? What if they think I'm just some entitled kid who inherited something she doesn't deserve?" Carol laughed, a rich sound that filled the cluttered studio. "Lauren, you're about to walk into a room full of people who rejected your parents' business proposal and then watched them sabotage their own daughter's interview out of spite. You think they're going to question your qualifications or your character?" She had a point. From Meridian Tech's perspective, I wasn't just Eleanor's granddaughter. I was also the victim of an unconscionable act of professional sabotage. They'd seen firsthand how my parents operated when they felt threatened, and it hadn't reflected well on their business ethics or their family values. "Besides," Carol continued, "Eleanor didn't leave you this company as a gift. She left it to you as a responsibility. She believed that you would use this power to create the kind of workplace where merit matters more than connections, where people are judged by their contributions rather than their family backgrounds. That's not just about running a business. That's about building a legacy." I stayed at Carol's house until evening, helping her clean up the studio and listening to stories about my grandmother that I'd never heard before. Eleanor had apparently been far more aware of family dynamics than anyone realized, quietly documenting instances of unfair treatment and building her case for why the traditional inheritance structure needed to be disrupted. Quote, "She showed me some of her notes once," Carol said as we carried tools back into the studio. "She'd been keeping track of every scholarship opportunity your parents forgot to mention to you, every family business discussion you were excluded from, every time they praised Brandon for achievements while dismissing your successes as luck or minimal effort. She had pages and pages of examples. Why didn't she ever say anything directly? Why didn't she confront them about it?" Carol shrugged. Eleanor was a strategist. She believed that people revealed their true character through their actions over time, and that the best way to address injustice was to create consequences that couldn't be argued away or rationalized. She could have confronted your parents, but they would have just gotten better at hiding their favoritism. This way, there's no room for denial or negotiation. The next morning, I dressed carefully for my meeting with the Meridian Tech board. I chose a charcoal gray suit that projected authority without being flashy, paired with my grandmother's pearl earrings for confidence. Looking at myself in the mirror, I saw someone who belonged in a boardroom, someone capable of making difficult decisions and standing behind them. Thomas Bennett had arranged for the meeting to take place at Meridian Tech's offices, in the same conference room where I'd been humiliated just over a week ago. The irony wasn't lost on me, and I suspected it wasn't accidental. Sometimes justice required a certain theatrical element to be fully appreciated. I arrived 15 minutes early, using the extra time to walk through the office space and observe the employees at work. The energy was exactly what I'd noticed during my interview. Collaborative, innovative, focused on problem-solving rather than politics. These were people who cared about their work and took pride in the company's reputation. They deserved leadership that shared those values. Patricia Williams greeted me at the conference room entrance, her expression professional but curious. "Lauren, thank you for coming in. I have to admit, this is not how I expected our paths to cross again." "I imagine not," I replied, taking the same seat I'd occupied during my interview. "I appreciate your willingness to meet on short notice." David Chen and James Rodriguez joined us, along with two other board members I recognized from my research: Susan Park, the Chief Technology Officer, and Marcus Thompson, the Chief Financial Officer. They arranged themselves around the table with the careful attention to hierarchy that marked experienced executives. Thomas Bennett entered last, carrying his familiar folder of documents. "Good morning, everyone. As I mentioned in my calls yesterday, we're here to discuss the ownership transition following Eleanor Hayes' death and the implications for Meridian Tech's governance structure." He distributed copies of the relevant will provisions and stock transfer documents, giving everyone time to review the details. I watched their faces as they processed the information, seeing surprise, calculation, and what might have been relief. Patricia spoke first. Mrs. Hayes was an ideal silent partner. She provided crucial startup funding when we needed it most, but never interfered with operational decisions or tried to impose her vision on our strategic direction. We always hoped that her eventual heir would share that philosophy. "What concerns me," David said, looking directly at me, "is the unusual circumstances surrounding your previous interaction with our company. The allegations made during your interview were serious, and while we now understand they were false, the family dynamics that led to that situation could potentially create ongoing complications." I had expected this question and prepared my response carefully. "You're absolutely right to be concerned about family complications affecting business operations. That's exactly why I'm here to address those issues directly, rather than allowing them to fester in the background." I pulled out a folder containing printouts of my research into Hayes & Associates' business situation. My parents sabotaged my interview because they saw my potential success at Meridian Tech as a threat to their own consulting business. They'd been rejected as vendors and were facing increased competition from companies with stronger digital marketing capabilities. Rather than improving their own services, they chose to eliminate what they perceived as competition. Marcus leaned forward, studying the financial documents I'd distributed. "These numbers suggest that Hayes & Associates is in a more precarious position than their public materials indicate." "Exactly. They're not just struggling competitors. They're desperate ones. That makes them unreliable partners and potentially problematic adversaries." I met each board member's eyes in turn. "I'm proposing that we address this situation proactively rather than waiting for them to create more problems." Susan spoke for the first time, her voice thoughtful. "What kind of proactive approach did you have in mind?" "Complete transparency. I want to document everything that happened during my interview process, including the specific lies that were told and the motivations behind them. I want that information made available to other potential employers or partners who might be considering business relationships with Hayes & Associates. Not as an act of revenge, but as a matter of professional responsibility." The room was quiet for a moment while they considered the implications. Finally, Patricia nodded slowly. "That's actually a very mature approach. Rather than trying to hide the family conflict or pretend it doesn't exist, you're suggesting we treat it as a business ethics issue." "Which is exactly what it is," I replied. "My parents made a business decision to sabotage a competitor, me, in order to protect their own interests. The fact that I'm their daughter doesn't change the fundamental nature of what they did." James had been taking notes throughout the conversation. "What about ongoing family relationships? How do you plan to handle the personal aspects of this situation?" I thought about my grandmother's letter, about her emphasis on using power wisely but decisively. My family relationships are secondary to my responsibilities as a majority shareholder. I'll maintain appropriate professional boundaries with anyone who might try to leverage personal connections for business advantage. Thomas Bennett cleared his throat. "If I may, there's another matter we should discuss. Eleanor's will includes specific provisions about how she wanted Meridian Tech to be managed. She was particularly concerned about maintaining ethical standards and ensuring that business decisions were made based on merit rather than personal relationships. He distributed another set of documents. She established what she called an integrity framework for company operations. It includes guidelines for vendor selection, hiring practices, and conflict of interest management. She wanted these principles formalized as part of the corporate governance structure. As I read through my grandmother's framework, I felt a deep sense of recognition. These weren't abstract ethical principles. They were responses to specific problems she'd observed in business environments where personal relationships and financial interests became entangled. She was trying to create a company culture that would prevent the kind of behavior my parents had demonstrated. "I think this framework should be our first priority," I said, "not just as a legal requirement, but as a practical tool for building the kind of workplace culture that attracts and retains the best talent." Patricia smiled, and for the first time since I'd entered the room, she looked genuinely pleased. "You know, when we rejected your application last week, we thought we were avoiding a potential problem. It turns out we were actually postponing an opportunity to work with someone who shares our values." The meeting continued for another hour, covering technical details about board representation, voting procedures, and transition timelines. By the time we finished, I had a clear understanding of my responsibilities and a concrete plan for assuming active ownership of the company. As the others filed out of the conference room, Patricia lingered behind. "Lauren, can I ask you something personal?" "Of course. How are you feeling about all of this? I mean, a week ago you were looking for a job, and now you're essentially my boss. That's got to be overwhelming." I considered her question carefully. "Honestly, it's terrifying, but it's also the first time in my adult life that I feel like I'm in control of my own destiny. My parents spent years convincing me that I wasn't ready for real responsibility, that I needed their guidance and protection to navigate the business world. But my grandmother saw something different. She saw someone capable of handling power responsibly, and she trusted me with something that mattered to her." Patricia nodded. Eleanor was an excellent judge of character. She never invested in anything, or anyone, without doing her homework first. That afternoon, I returned to my apartment and began the process of reorganizing my life around my new responsibilities. I called the other companies where I'd submitted job applications and withdrew my candidacy, explaining that I'd accepted a position that met my career goals. I updated my LinkedIn profile to reflect my new role as majority shareholder and board member at Meridian Tech, and I began researching everything I could find about corporate governance, technology industry trends, and the specific challenges facing software consulting firms. But most importantly, I started planning how to implement my grandmother's integrity framework in a way that would address the systemic problems she'd identified. This wasn't just about preventing future incidents of nepotism or sabotage. It was about creating a workplace where success was determined by merit and contribution rather than family connections or political maneuvering. My phone rang around 6 o'clock. The caller ID showed my mother's number, but I let it go to voicemail. An hour later, it rang again with a call from my father. Then Brandon. Then my mother again. I ignored them all, not because I was afraid to talk to them, but because I wanted to establish clear boundaries about when and how we would communicate going forward. Finally, around 9 o'clock, I listened to the voicemails. My mother's message was predictably manipulative. "Lauren, honey, I know you're upset with us, but we're still your family. We love you and we want to work through this together. Please call me back so we can talk about how to move forward." My father's message was more direct. "Lauren, we need to discuss the implications of this inheritance situation. There are business considerations that affect the whole family, and decisions that shouldn't be made in isolation. Call me back." Brandon's message was the most honest. "Lauren, I know I should have warned you about what Mom and Dad were planning with your interview. I was hoping it would blow over without causing permanent damage. I was wrong, and I'm sorry. I think we should talk." I didn't return any of the calls. Instead, I poured myself a glass of wine and sat on my couch with my laptop, drafting an email to Thomas Bennett outlining my priorities for the next phase of the transition process. At the top of the list was implementing a comprehensive vendor review policy that would prevent Hayes & Associates, or any other company with documented ethical violations, from being considered for future contracts. The next few days passed in a blur of meetings, legal paperwork, and intensive research. I met with each department head at Meridian Tech, learning about their projects, their challenges, and their perspectives on company culture. I reviewed financial statements, strategic plans, and competitive analyses. I attended my first official board meeting and cast my first votes on operational decisions. Through it all, I felt my grandmother's presence, guiding my choices. She had seen something in me that my parents had spent years trying to diminish, and she had trusted me with the tools to prove them wrong. Every decision I made, every policy I supported, every conversation I had with employees was informed by her belief that merit should matter more than connections, that integrity should be valued more than convenience. By Friday of that week, I felt ready to address the situation with my family directly. Not because I wanted reconciliation or because I missed their presence in my life, but because I wanted to establish clear boundaries for any future interactions. They needed to understand that the power dynamic had fundamentally changed, and that their previous tactics of manipulation and control would no longer be effective. I scheduled a meeting for Saturday morning at Thomas Bennett's office, the same conference room where the will reading had taken place. The symmetry felt appropriate. We were going to finish what had started there, and everyone needed to understand exactly where things stood going forward. The call to my father was brief and businesslike. "I want to meet with you, Mom and Brandon, tomorrow morning at 10 o'clock at Thomas Bennett's office. We have some things to discuss." "Lauren, finally. We've been trying to reach you all week. There are so many things we need to work out, so many opportunities for the family to benefit from this situation." "This isn't about opportunities," I replied. "This is about accountability. If you want to have any kind of relationship with me going forward, you'll be there tomorrow. If you don't show up, you can consider our family ties permanently severed." I hung up before he could respond, feeling a sense of clarity that I hadn't experienced in years. For the first time in my adult life, I was setting the terms of engagement with my family. I was done being reactive, done accepting their version of events, done making excuses for their behavior. Tomorrow, they would learn exactly what kind of person their betrayal had created. And they would discover that sometimes, the daughter you try to diminish becomes the woman who holds your future in her hands. That evening, I called Aunt Carol to let her know about the planned meeting. Her response was immediate and enthusiastic. "It's about time. Eleanor would be so proud of how you're handling this." "I'm nervous," I admitted. "What if they try to turn this around somehow, make me feel guilty for holding them accountable?" "Then you remember that they made a choice to sabotage your career for their own benefit," Carol replied firmly. "You didn't create this situation, Lauren. You're just dealing with the consequences of their actions. And for the first time, those consequences involve them facing someone who has the power to push back." She paused, and I could hear the smile in her voice. "Besides, you have something they've never had to deal with before: the moral high ground and the financial resources to maintain it. They can't gaslight someone who holds the evidence and the power to act on it." I spent Saturday morning preparing for the meeting like it was the most important presentation of my life. I organized documents, reviewed timelines, and practiced articulating my boundaries in language that left no room for misinterpretation. This wasn't going to be an emotional confrontation. It was going to be a business meeting where the terms of our future relationship were clearly defined. When I arrived at Thomas Bennett's office, my family was already waiting in the same conference room where everything had changed a week earlier. They looked like they were attending a funeral, which, in a way, they were. The family dynamic that had sustained them for decades was about to be buried permanently. I took my seat at the head of the table, the position that had been empty during the will reading. The symbolism wasn't lost on anyone in the room. "Thank you for coming," I began, my voice steady and professional. "I wanted to meet with you to establish some ground rules for how we'll interact going forward, both personally and professionally." My mother started to speak, but I held up a hand to stop her. "I'm going to talk first, and then you'll have an opportunity to respond. But this isn't a negotiation. These are the terms, and you can either accept them or walk away." I opened the folder I'd brought and distributed copies of a document I'd prepared the night before. "This is a comprehensive timeline of events related to my job search and your sabotage of my interview at Meridian Tech. It includes dates, specific accusations that were made, and documentation of your business motivations for interfering with my career prospects." My father scanned the document, his face growing pale as he read. "Lauren, this makes us look like criminals." You are criminals, I replied calmly. Filing false reports about someone's criminal history is defamation. Interfering with their employment opportunities for your own financial benefit is tortious interference. You committed actual crimes, and the only reason you're not facing legal consequences is because I've chosen not to pursue them. Brandon looked up from his copy of the timeline. What do you want from us, Lauren? An apology? We can apologize. We can admit we made mistakes. I don't want your apologies. Apologies don't undo the damage you caused, and they don't address the underlying problem, which is that you see me as an obstacle to be managed rather than a person deserving of respect. I pulled out another document. What I want is accountability. This is a formal business ethics policy that I'm implementing at Meridian Tech. It includes provisions about vendor relationships, conflict of interest management, and transparency in all business dealings. Hayes & Associates will be permanently barred from consideration for any contracts or partnerships with Meridian Tech. My mother's composure finally cracked. You can't do that. You can't use your inheritance to destroy our business out of spite. I'm not destroying your business out of spite, I replied. I'm protecting my company from vendors who have demonstrated a willingness to engage in unethical behavior when they feel threatened by competition. You made a business decision to sabotage a competitor, me, and now you're facing the business consequences of that decision. The room fell silent as the full implications of my position became clear. I wasn't just their daughter anymore. I was the person who controlled access to one of the most lucrative potential contracts in their market sector, and I was using that power to hold them accountable for their actions. My father tried one last appeal to family loyalty. Lauren, we're your parents. We love you. We made a mistake, but we're still family. Doesn't that count for something? I looked at him across the table, this man who had raised me but never truly seen me, who had claimed to love me while systematically undermining my opportunities for independence and success. Family isn't about shared DNA, I said quietly. It's about treating each other with respect, supporting each other's growth, and wanting the best for each other even when it's inconvenient. You failed at being family long before I inherited this company. I stood up, gathering my documents. You have a choice to make. You can accept that our relationship has changed permanently, and we can interact as polite acquaintances when necessary. Or you can continue trying to manipulate and control me, in which case I'll cut off all contact and ensure that your business practices become public knowledge throughout the Portland business community. I paused at the door, looking back at the three people who had shaped my understanding of what family could be and what it should never be again. I'm not angry anymore. I'm grateful. Your betrayal led me to discover my own strength, and it gave me the opportunity to build something better than what you offered me. Grandmother Eleanor saw that potential in me, and she made sure I'd have the resources to fulfill it. As I walked out of Thomas Bennett's office for the last time, I felt a lightness that I hadn't experienced since childhood. The weight of family expectations, of trying to earn approval that would never come, of making excuses for behavior that couldn't be excused, all of it was gone. I was free to become whoever I was meant to be, armed with the tools and the authority to create the kind of workplace and the kind of life that aligned with my values. My phone buzzed with a text from Patricia Williams. Board meeting moved to Monday morning. Hope you're ready to dive into strategic planning. The future is looking bright. I smiled as I typed back, ready and excited, let's build something extraordinary. For the first time in my life, I truly believed that we could. Monday morning arrived with the kind of crisp October weather that made Portland feel electric with possibility. I stood in front of my bathroom mirror, adjusting the collar of a burgundy blouse that I'd paired with my most confident black suit. Today marked my first strategic planning meeting as an active board member, and I wanted to project authority without arrogance, competence without defensiveness. The drive to Meridian Tech took me through the heart of downtown, past coffee shops filled with entrepreneurs and tech workers, starting their week. I found myself noticing details I'd missed before. The collaborative energy visible through office windows, the casual confidence of people who worked in an industry built on innovation rather than tradition. This was my world now, and I was ready to help shape its future. The Meridian Tech building looked different to me as I walked through the lobby. 2 weeks ago, I'd been a nervous job candidate hoping to impress strangers with my qualifications. Today, I was a stakeholder with the authority to influence the company's direction and the responsibility to protect its values. The transformation felt surreal, but it also felt right in a way that nothing in my professional life ever had before. Patricia Williams greeted me outside the boardroom with a warm smile and a cup of coffee prepared exactly how I'd mentioned liking it during our previous conversations. Ready for your first strategic planning session as an owner rather than an applicant? More ready than I've ever been for anything, I replied, meaning every word. The boardroom was already buzzing with activity when we entered. Susan Park had multiple laptops open, displaying financial projections and market analysis data. Marcus Thompson was reviewing quarterly reports while taking notes on a legal pad. David Chen was coordinating with his assistant about scheduling follow-up meetings. James Rodriguez sat quietly at the far end of the table, observing the controlled chaos with the practiced eye of someone who had attended hundreds of similar meetings. Good morning, everyone. Patricia called the meeting to order as I took my seat. Today we're focusing on 3 major initiatives: market expansion opportunities, talent acquisition strategies, and the implementation of our new integrity framework. Lauren, since the integrity framework was one of your grandmother's specific priorities, would you like to lead that discussion? I opened the folder I'd prepared over the weekend, feeling nervous but determined. Thank you, Patricia. Before we dive into the framework itself, I want to address why this initiative matters so much to our company's long-term success. I activated the presentation screen and displayed the first slide I'd created. The software consulting industry is becoming increasingly competitive, with new firms entering the market every month. What differentiates successful companies isn't just technical expertise, it's reputation for ethical business practices and reliable partnerships. Susan looked up from her laptops. Are you suggesting that our current ethical standards are insufficient? Not insufficient, but informal, I clarified. Right now, we rely on individual judgment and personal integrity to guide our business decisions. That works well when everyone shares the same values, but it becomes problematic when we're dealing with external partners, vendors, or clients who might have different ethical frameworks. I clicked to the next slide, which displayed a matrix I'd developed based on my grandmother's notes. This framework establishes clear criteria for evaluating potential business relationships. It includes financial stability, professional reputation, treatment of employees, and demonstrated commitment to honest business practices. Marcus leaned forward, studying the criteria. This looks comprehensive, but also potentially restrictive. Are we prepared to turn down profitable opportunities because a potential partner doesn't meet all these standards? Absolutely, I replied without hesitation. Short-term profits that compromise our long-term reputation aren't actually profitable. They're expensive mistakes that we'll pay for later. David raised his hand. Can you give us a specific example of how this framework would apply to a real business situation? I had been expecting this question and had prepared my response carefully. Last month, Hayes & Associates submitted a proposal for our marketing consulting contract. Under our previous evaluation process, we might have considered their proposal based solely on their technical qualifications and pricing. Under the new framework, we would also evaluate their business ethics record. I clicked to a slide displaying public records I'd compiled about my parents' company. Hayes & Associates has a pattern of problematic behavior including client contract disputes, employee turnover issues, and recently interference with competitor hiring processes through false accusations. These aren't technical disqualifications, but they are ethical red flags that suggest potential future problems. James Rodriguez spoke for the first time. You're talking about your own family's company. Doesn't that create a conflict of interest in terms of how we evaluate their proposal? It creates the opposite of a conflict of interest, I replied. I have inside knowledge about their business practices that other potential clients wouldn't have access to. Using that knowledge to protect Meridian Tech from a problematic vendor relationship is exactly the kind of informed decision-making this framework is designed to support. Patricia nodded approvingly. That's a mature way to handle a complex situation. You're prioritizing business ethics over personal relationships. Which brings me to the larger point, I continued, clicking to my final slide. This framework isn't just about vendor relationships. It's about creating a company culture where decisions are made based on merit and ethics, rather than personal connections or political considerations. That applies to hiring, promotion, project assignments, and partnership decisions. Susan closed her laptops and gave me her full attention. What would implementation look like from a practical standpoint? Are we talking about additional paperwork, formal review processes, training programs? All of the above, but implemented gradually so we don't disrupt ongoing operations, I explained. I've drafted a timeline that phases in different components over the next 6 months. We start with vendor evaluation criteria, move to hiring and promotion standards, and finish with comprehensive ethics training for all employees. Marcus was taking detailed notes. What about cost? Training programs and formal review processes require resources. I've budgeted for the implementation costs, I replied, and I'm prepared to fund them from my personal resources if necessary. This isn't just a business initiative. It's an investment in the kind of company culture that attracts and retains the best talent. The discussion continued for another hour, with each board member asking detailed questions about specific aspects of the framework. I found myself energized by their engagement, by the way they challenged my proposals not to undermine them but to strengthen them. This was the kind of collaborative environment I dreamed of working in, one where ideas were evaluated on their merit rather than dismissed based on personal politics. When we broke for lunch, Patricia pulled me aside. That was impressive. You've clearly thought through not just the principles but the practical implementation challenges. Your grandmother would be proud. Thank you. It feels good to finally be in a position where I can contribute to something meaningful, instead of just hoping for opportunities that might never come. Speaking of opportunities, Patricia said, we've received several inquiries from other companies interested in partnering with us on major projects. Some of them are significant enough that they'll require board approval. Are you prepared to take on that level of decision-making responsibility? The question was both thrilling and terrifying. 6 months ago, I'd been doing data entry and research projects for my parents' struggling consulting firm. Now I was being asked to help evaluate multi-million-dollar partnership opportunities for a company I partially owned. I'm prepared to learn, I replied. I may not have extensive experience with these kinds of decisions, but I have strong analytical skills and a clear understanding of what kind of company we want to be. Sometimes fresh perspective can be as valuable as extensive experience. After lunch, we moved into market expansion discussions. Susan presented data about potential new client sectors, while Marcus analyzed the financial implications of scaling our operations. David outlined talent acquisition needs for supporting expanded services. I listened carefully, asking questions when I needed clarification but mostly absorbing information about how successful businesses identified and pursued growth opportunities. What about the education sector? I asked during a pause in the presentations. I've been researching potential markets, and it seems like schools and universities are increasingly interested in technology consulting, but often can't afford the same rates as corporate clients. Susan pulled up market data on her laptop. You're right that there's growing demand, but the profit margins are typically much lower than our corporate work. What if we approached it differently, I suggested. Instead of trying to maintain the same profit margins, what if we structured education partnerships as a combination of paid consulting and skills development for our junior employees? They get real-world experience with complex projects, schools get access to cutting-edge expertise, and we build relationships with future talent pipelines. The room went quiet as everyone processed my suggestion. Finally, Marcus smiled. That's actually brilliant. We've been struggling with how to provide meaningful development opportunities for junior staff without overwhelming them or risking client relationships. This could solve both problems simultaneously. Patricia was already taking notes. It also positions us as a company that cares about social impact, not just profits. That kind of reputation attracts both clients and employees who share those values. Exactly, I agreed. And it demonstrates our commitment to the kind of ethical business practices we've been discussing. We're not just talking about integrity, we're actively investing in community development. The afternoon session flew by as we developed the education partnership concept into a concrete proposal. I found myself contributing ideas and insights that drew on my academic background, my research into industry trends, and my understanding of how different organizational cultures approached innovation. For the first time in my professional life, I felt like my voice was not just heard but valued. As the meeting wrapped up, James Rodriguez approached me with a thoughtful expression. Lauren, can I ask you something? How are you handling the emotional aspects of this transition? It's gotta be complicated, moving from family conflict to business leadership in such a short time frame. I considered his question carefully. It's definitely complex, but in some ways, the professional challenges are easier to navigate than the family dynamics were. Here, decisions are made based on clear criteria and measurable outcomes. With my family, everything was subjective and constantly changing based on their emotional needs or business interests. Have you heard from them since your meeting on Saturday? Radio silence, which is probably for the best right now. I need time to establish my identity in this role without constantly defending my decisions to people who have never respected my judgment anyway. James nodded understandingly. One piece of advice, if you're open to it, document everything. Not just for legal protection, but for your own clarity. When you're dealing with people who have a history of gaslighting and manipulation, written records become crucial for maintaining perspective. His advice resonated deeply. My parents had spent years convincing me that my perceptions were wrong, that my emotional reactions were overblown, that their treatment of me was normal and justified. Having clear documentation of events and decisions would help me maintain confidence in my own judgment. That evening, I returned to my apartment and began implementing James's suggestion. I created a detailed record of every significant interaction since the will reading, including the board meeting discussions, my family's reactions to the new business policies, and my own emotional responses to each development. The act of writing everything down helped me process the magnitude of the changes in my life, while also creating a reference point for future decisions. My phone buzzed with a text from Aunt Carol. How did your first board meeting go? Are you feeling more confident about your new role? I called her instead of texting back, wanting to share the excitement I felt about the day's accomplishments. Carol, it was incredible. I presented the integrity framework to the board, and they didn't just accept it, they helped me improve it. They treated my ideas like they had real value. Because they do have real value, Carol replied warmly. You've spent years developing skills and perspectives that your parents refuse to acknowledge. Now you're finally in an environment where those abilities can be recognized and utilized. There's something else, I continued. We started developing a new initiative to partner with educational institutions. It was my idea, and the board was genuinely enthusiastic about it. I feel like I'm actually contributing to something meaningful instead of just hoping someone will give me a chance to prove myself. That's wonderful, Lauren. Eleanor would be so proud to see you taking ownership of your talents instead of apologizing for them. After we hung up, I sat at my kitchen table with my laptop open, researching everything I could find about successful educational partnerships in the technology consulting industry. This wasn't homework assigned by someone else. It was self-directed learning driven by my own enthusiasm for a project I'd helped create. The difference in my motivation level was remarkable. Tuesday morning brought my first crisis as a board member. I arrived at the office to find Patricia waiting for me with a grim expression and a folder full of documents. We have a problem, she said without preamble. Hayes & Associates is threatening legal action over our decision to exclude them from the vendor selection process. They're claiming discrimination based on family relationships. My stomach dropped. I had known my parents would react badly to being blacklisted, but I hadn't expected them to escalate to legal threats quite so quickly. What exactly are they claiming? I asked, following Patricia to her office. Their attorney sent a letter alleging that your personal animosity toward your family is influencing business decisions inappropriately. They're demanding that you recuse yourself from any discussions involving their company, and they're threatening to sue for damages if we don't reverse our vendor exclusion decision. I sank into the chair across from Patricia's desk, feeling the weight of family drama threatening to undermine everything I was trying to build. Do they have a case? Not a strong one, Patricia replied. But nuisance lawsuits can be expensive and time-consuming even when they're ultimately unsuccessful. More importantly, this kind of public conflict could damage our professional reputation if it's not handled carefully. I took a deep breath, centering myself before responding. What do you think our best strategy is? Full transparency, Patricia said immediately. We document everything. The reasons for our vendor evaluation criteria, the specific evidence that led to their exclusion, and the business rationale for all our decisions. If they want to make this public, we make sure the public has access to all the facts, including the evidence of their sabotage of my interview, especially that evidence. It demonstrates that our concerns about their business ethics aren't based on family conflict. They're based on documented professional misconduct. I felt a surge of gratitude for Patricia's straightforward approach. Instead of asking me to back down or compromise to avoid conflict, she was suggesting we meet the challenge head-on with facts and transparency. "What do you need from me?" I asked. "Everything you've documented about their interference with your job search, plus any other evidence of problematic business practices you might have access to. We're going to build a case so comprehensive that their attorney will advise them to drop the threats, rather than face public scrutiny of their client's ethics record." I spent the rest of the day compiling evidence and preparing a detailed response to my parents' legal threats. The process was emotionally draining but also empowering. For years, their ability to manipulate situations and control narratives had made me feel helpless. Now, armed with documentation and legal support, I could respond to their intimidation tactics with facts rather than emotion. Wednesday brought another challenge. A major client was considering terminating their contract due to concerns about instability in company leadership. Apparently, word of the family conflict had reached some of our business partners, and they were worried about potential disruptions to ongoing projects. "This is exactly what my parents wanted," I told Susan during an emergency meeting. "They're trying to create the professional chaos they warned people about." "Then we prove them wrong," Susan replied firmly. "We demonstrate that our company culture and project delivery capabilities are stronger than any personal drama. We show our clients that professional excellence isn't dependent on family harmony." Over the next 2 days, we implemented a comprehensive client communication strategy. Every major account received a personal call from Patricia explaining the ownership transition and our commitment to maintaining service quality. Department heads reached out to their project contacts to address any concerns about continuity. I prepared a memo outlining my qualifications and vision for the company that could be shared with any clients who requested information about the new leadership structure. The response was overwhelmingly positive. Far from being concerned about my involvement in company leadership, most clients were impressed by the transparency and professionalism of our communication. Several mentioned that they appreciated working with a company that took ethics seriously enough to formalize their standards and address conflicts directly. By Friday afternoon, my parents' attorney had withdrawn their legal threats. Apparently, when faced with the prospect of defending their clients' business practices in a public forum, they decided that discretion was the better part of valor. The crisis had actually strengthened our position by forcing us to articulate clearly why our vendor standards mattered and how they protected both our company and our clients. "You handled that beautifully," Patricia told me as we debriefed the week's events. "Instead of getting defensive or trying to minimize the family conflict, you used it as an opportunity to demonstrate our commitment to ethical business practices. That's exactly the kind of leadership approach this company needs." "I had good guidance," I replied. "And I'm learning that transparency really is the best strategy for dealing with people who prefer to operate in shadows and ambiguity." That weekend, I received an unexpected visitor. Brandon knocked on my apartment door Saturday morning, looking like he hadn't slept well in several days. I almost didn't answer, but curiosity got the better of me. "What do you want, Brandon?" "To apologize. Really apologize, not the kind of non-apology I gave you at the lawyer's office." He looked genuinely distressed. "Can I come in? Please?" Against my better judgment, I let him into my living room. He sat on the edge of my couch like he wasn't sure he was welcome to get comfortable. "Lauren, I need you to know that I had no idea they were going to call Meridian Tech until after it happened. When they told me what they'd done, I should have warned you immediately. I should have called David Chen and told him the truth. I was a coward, and I'm sorry." I studied his face, looking for signs of manipulation or strategic calculation. What I saw instead was genuine guilt and something that might have been shame. "Why didn't you warn me?" "Because I was terrified of confronting them. I've spent my entire life avoiding conflict with Mom and Dad, accepting their version of reality even when I knew it was wrong. I told myself that warning you would just make things worse, that maybe the damage could be contained somehow. And now? Brandon ran his hands through his hair. Now I see what the cost of my silence has been. Not just to you, but to our entire family. We've created this toxic dynamic where truth gets sacrificed to maintain peace, where protecting their feelings matters more than protecting each other. I felt a flicker of hope that maybe, finally, someone in my family was beginning to understand the patterns that had shaped our relationships for decades. What changed your mind? The legal threats, he admitted. When they decided to attack you professionally for holding them accountable, I realized that they weren't going to learn from this experience. They were going to escalate it. And I couldn't be part of that anymore. We talked for 2 hours, covering years of family dynamics that neither of us had ever addressed directly. Brandon acknowledged the favoritism he'd benefited from, the opportunities he'd been given that I'd been denied, and the ways he'd remained silent when he should have spoken up. It wasn't a complete healing of our relationship, but it was the beginning of honesty that had never existed between us before. What happens now? He asked as he prepared to leave. I don't know, I replied truthfully. But I'm not going to spend my energy trying to fix relationships with people who aren't willing to acknowledge that they're broken. You're acknowledging it, which is a start. Mom and Dad aren't, which is their choice. They're scared, Lauren. The business is struggling more than they've admitted, and losing the possibility of Meridian Tech contracts has them panicked. Not that it excuses what they did, he added quickly, but fear makes people do terrible things sometimes. After Brandon left, I sat on my couch processing the conversation. Part of me was relieved that at least one family member was willing to face reality about our dynamics. But a larger part of me recognized that understanding the motivations behind harmful behavior didn't obligate me to accept it or work to repair the damage. My phone rang with a call from Thomas Bennett. Lauren, I wanted to give you a heads up about something. Your parents have contacted me about contesting the will. They're claiming that Eleanor was unduly influenced, or that she wasn't competent to make such significant changes to her estate plan. I felt a familiar knot form in my stomach. Do they have grounds for that kind of challenge? Quote, not legitimate ones. Eleanor was evaluated by multiple physicians in the months before her death, and all of them confirmed her mental competency. She also worked with multiple attorneys to ensure that her will would withstand any challenges. But contested wills can create complications even when they're ultimately unsuccessful. What kind of complications? Potential freezing of assets during the contest period, negative publicity, and significant legal expenses for all parties involved. They're essentially threatening to create maximum chaos in hopes that you'll agree to some kind of settlement rather than fight. I thought about my grandmother's letter, about her emphasis on using power decisively. Eleanor had anticipated this possibility and had given me the tools to respond effectively. Thomas, I want to fight any contest as aggressively as possible. I want discovery processes that examine their business practices, their financial records, and their treatment of family members over the years. If they want to make this public, let's make sure the public sees everything. That's a costly strategy, Lauren. It's an investment in setting boundaries that will protect me for the rest of my life. Some things are worth the expense. Monday morning brought news that would change everything once again. Patricia called me at home before I'd even had coffee. Lauren, you need to get down here immediately. We just received a buyout offer. A what? A major corporation wants to acquire Meridian Tech. We're talking about a deal that would make you wealthy beyond anything you've probably imagined. But there are conditions attached that we need to discuss. I dressed quickly and drove to the office, my mind racing with possibilities. A buyout offer could solve multiple problems simultaneously. It would provide financial resources that would make my parents' legal threats irrelevant, establish my independence permanently, and validate everything my grandmother had believed about the company's potential. But as I walked into the boardroom where the entire board was waiting with serious expressions, I had a feeling that this opportunity would come with complications that I couldn't yet imagine. The next phase of my transformation was about to begin. The boardroom felt different that morning, charged with an electricity that made everyone sit straighter in their chairs. Patricia had arranged the documents in neat stacks across the conference table, each pile representing different aspects of what she described as the opportunity of a lifetime. I took my usual seat, noting that Thomas Bennett was present alongside our regular board members. Never a good sign when lawyers appeared for supposedly routine business discussions. The offer came from Cascade Industries, Patricia began, sliding a bound proposal across the table to me. They're a Seattle-based conglomerate that's been aggressively acquiring mid-sized tech companies throughout the Pacific Northwest. Their initial offer is $230 million for complete acquisition of Meridian Tech. I stared at the number, trying to process what it meant for my personal financial situation. As the majority shareholder, I would receive over $100 million from the sale. More money than I could spend in several lifetimes. More money than my parents had accumulated in their entire careers. More money than my grandmother had probably imagined when she made her investment decision years ago. What's the catch? I asked. Because there had to be one. Companies didn't offer this kind of money without expecting significant returns on their investment. Marcus opened his copy of the proposal. Several catches, actually. They want to restructure our client base to focus exclusively on large corporate accounts. They want to eliminate what they call unprofitable community partnerships, which would include our planned educational sector initiatives. And they want to replace current management with their own executive team. Meaning all of us would be terminated, Susan added bluntly. They're buying the client relationships and the technical infrastructure, not the people who built them. David leaned forward, his expression troubled. There's also a clause requiring unanimous board approval for the sale. If any board member objects, the deal dies completely. I understood immediately why Thomas Bennett was present. This wasn't just a business decision. It was a test of everything I claimed to believe about ethical leadership and long-term thinking versus short-term financial gain. What would happen to our current employees? I asked. Some would be retained in technical roles, but probably at reduced compensation levels, Patricia replied. Cascade's business model depends on maximizing profit margins by minimizing labor costs. They're not known for prioritizing employee satisfaction or professional development. And our smaller clients? The ones who can't afford to pay corporate rates? They'd be dropped immediately. Cascade only services Fortune 500 companies and government contracts. Everything else is considered a distraction from core profitability. I picked up the proposal and flipped through its pages, noting the corporate language that described human beings as redundant resources and community partnerships as margin dilution factors. This wasn't just a buyout offer, it was a complete repudiation of everything my grandmother had valued about the company she'd helped create. How long do we have to respond? 48 hours, Thomas replied. They're claiming that market conditions require rapid decision-making, but realistically they're trying to pressure us into accepting before we can fully evaluate the implications. James Rodriguez had been quiet throughout the presentation, but now he cleared his throat. Lauren, I want to be very clear about something. As the majority shareholder, you have the power to approve the sale unilaterally if you choose to. The unanimous board requirement is a negotiating position, not a legal constraint. If you want to accept this offer, no one in this room can stop you. The weight of that responsibility settled on my shoulders like a heavy coat. 6 months ago, I'd been struggling to find entry-level employment in my chosen field. Now I was being asked to make a decision that would affect the livelihoods of dozens of employees, the business prospects of countless small clients, and the future direction of an entire industry sector. I need to think about this, I said finally. Can we reconvene tomorrow morning to discuss our response? Of course, Patricia replied. But Lauren, I want you to know that whatever you decide, we'll support your choice. This is an incredible opportunity, and no one would blame you for taking it. I left the office that afternoon carrying copies of the buyout proposal and a growing sense of unease about the decision I was facing. The rational part of my brain kept returning to the financial security that $100 million would provide. I could pursue any career I wanted, support any cause I believed in, and never worry about my parents' ability to sabotage my professional prospects again. But another part of me kept thinking about the employees I'd met during my first weeks at Meridian Tech. People who were excited about the educational partnerships we'd discussed, who took pride in the company's reputation for ethical business practices. Would selling to Cascade Industries betray their trust and undermine everything we'd worked to build? I drove to Aunt Carol's house, needing perspective from someone who understood family dynamics but wasn't invested in the business outcome. I found her in her backyard garden, harvesting late-season tomatoes while her cat supervised from a sunny patch of grass. "You look like someone carrying the weight of the world," she observed, setting down her basket to give me her full attention. I explained the buyout offer, the financial implications, and the ethical concerns that were keeping me awake at night. Carol listened without interrupting, occasionally nodding or asking clarifying questions about specific aspects of the proposal. "What would Eleanor want you to do?" she asked when I finished. "I think she'd want me to prioritize long-term ethical considerations over short-term financial gain. But Carol, it's $100 million. That's generational wealth. That's the kind of financial security that makes every other problem in my life irrelevant." Carol smiled, picking up a ripe tomato and examining it thoughtfully. "You know, when Eleanor first invested in Meridian Tech, she could have chosen dozens of other opportunities that would have provided faster returns. Tech startups, real estate developments, stock market investments. She chose Meridian Tech because she believed in what they were trying to build, not because she needed the money. But she didn't know then that her investment would be worth this much. Didn't she?" Carol asked. Eleanor was one of the shrewdest investors I ever knew. She understood compound growth, market timing, and long-term value creation better than most professional financial advisors. If she'd wanted to maximize short-term returns, she would have structured her investment very differently. I hadn't considered that perspective. My grandmother's investment in Meridian Tech hadn't been a lucky guess. It had been a calculated bet on a company whose values aligned with her own beliefs about how business should be conducted. "What do you think I should do?" "I think you should make the decision that allows you to look at yourself in the mirror without regret," Carol replied. "Money is important, but it's not the only thing that matters. Sometimes the most valuable thing you can own is your own integrity." That evening, I sat at my kitchen table with the buyout proposal spread in front of me, trying to envision my life in both scenarios. If I accepted the offer, I would be wealthy beyond imagination, but unemployed and disconnected from the work that had given my life purpose. If I rejected it, I would remain financially comfortable but not rich. And I would take responsibility for steering a company through an increasingly competitive market. The decision became clearer when I realized I wasn't just choosing between money and principles, I was choosing between security and purpose. The buyout offer represented the ultimate safety net, protection from every financial worry or professional setback I might face in the future. But it also represented a return to the passive role I'd occupied for most of my life, waiting for other people to create opportunities instead of building them myself. My phone rang around 10 o'clock. The caller ID showed my mother's number, which surprised me given our lack of communication since the family meeting at Thomas Bennett's office. "Lauren, honey, I hope I'm not calling too late." Her voice had the carefully modulated tone she used when she wanted something but wasn't sure how receptive her audience would be. "What do you want, Mom?" "I heard through the business community that Meridian Tech might be considering a sale. I wanted to congratulate you on what must be an incredibly lucrative opportunity." I wondered how she'd heard about the buyout offer so quickly, then remembered that Portland's business community was smaller than it appeared. News about major acquisitions traveled fast through professional networks. "I haven't made any decisions yet." "Of course not, sweetheart. These are complicated matters that require careful consideration. Your father and I have been discussing the situation, and we think it might be helpful for you to have some guidance from people with more experience in major business transactions." There it was. The offer of help that came with strings attached, the suggestion that I wasn't qualified to handle important decisions without their input. 6 months ago, I might have been grateful for their involvement. Now I recognized it as another attempt to insert themselves into my success after trying to prevent it. "Mom, I have excellent legal and financial advisors. I don't need additional guidance." "But we're your family, Lauren. We want what's best for you. And we have experience with business valuations and negotiations that could be valuable in a situation like this." I almost laughed at the irony. My parents, whose own business was struggling financially, were offering to advise me on a transaction worth more than their entire company's lifetime revenue. What's best for me is making my own decisions based on my own values and priorities. "But thank you for the offer." There was a pause, and when my mother spoke again, her tone had shifted from helpful to calculating. "Lauren, I hope you'll remember that this opportunity exists because of family investments. Your grandmother's money came from the Hayes family legacy, and the benefits should be shared accordingly. The benefits are being shared according to grandmother's specific instructions. She chose how to distribute her wealth, and she chose to leave Meridian Tech to me. But surely you understand that family loyalty should influence how you handle such a significant windfall. There are ways to structure business transactions that benefit everyone, not just the immediate owner. I felt my temper rising but kept my voice level. Mom, if you're asking whether I plan to share the proceeds of a potential sale with family members who sabotaged my career and then threatened to sue me for holding them accountable, the answer is no. Lauren, that's not fair. We made mistakes, but we're still your parents. We still love you. Love isn't a financial obligation, and your version of love has been consistently conditional on my willingness to accept diminished opportunities so that other family members could benefit. I'm done with that arrangement. I hung up before she could respond, feeling both angry and relieved. The conversation had clarified something important. My parents viewed my potential windfall as an opportunity for their own financial recovery. They weren't concerned about my well-being or my professional fulfillment. They were concerned about their access to resources they felt entitled to share. Tuesday morning arrived gray and drizzling, with the kind of persistent northwest rain that made everyone walk a little faster and think a little more seriously about indoor activities. I arrived at Meridian Tech early, wanting time to review my decision one final time before presenting it to the board. The proposal still lay on my desk where I'd left it the previous afternoon, its pristine binding and professional typography giving no hint of the human costs buried in its financial projections. I'd made my choice during the sleepless hours before dawn, but I wanted to be absolutely certain I could articulate my reasoning clearly and confidently. Patricia knocked on my office door at 8:30. Ready for the meeting, or do you need more time? I'm ready. But Patricia, before we go in there, I want you to know how much I appreciate the way you've handled this entire situation. You could have pressured me to take the buyout for everyone's financial benefit, but instead you've supported whatever decision felt right to me. That's what good leadership looks like, she replied. Making space for people to make informed choices rather than manipulating them toward predetermined outcomes. The boardroom felt more formal than usual, with everyone taking their seats quietly and arranging their materials with unusual precision. I could sense the tension beneath their professional demeanor. They were all wondering whether their jobs would exist by the end of the day. Thank you all for your patience while I considered this opportunity. I began, standing at the head of the table with the proposal in front of me. Before I announce my decision, I want to explain the reasoning behind it. I picked up the buyout documents and held them in both hands. This offer represents more money than most people see in their entire lifetimes. It would solve every financial concern I've ever had and provide security for generations of my family. From a purely economic standpoint, accepting it would be the rational choice. I could see the resignation beginning to form on their faces, the premature acceptance of an outcome they'd feared but expected. However, I continued, I didn't inherit Meridian Tech to maximize my personal wealth. I inherited it to continue building the kind of company my grandmother believed in, one that prioritizes long-term ethical considerations over short-term financial gains. I placed the proposal back on the table. Cascade Industries wants to buy our client relationships and our technical infrastructure, but they want to dismantle everything that makes those relationships valuable. They want to eliminate our community partnerships, terminate our employee development programs, and reduce our workforce to the minimum necessary for basic operations. Susan sat up straighter in her chair. Are you saying what I think you're saying? I'm saying that we're going to decline their offer. We're going to continue building Meridian Tech as an independent company that demonstrates how business success and ethical practices can coexist and strengthen each other. The silence that followed lasted only a few seconds, but it felt like minutes. Then Marcus started laughing, not with humor, but with relief and disbelief. Lauren, do you understand what you just turned down? We're talking about enough money to buy small countries. I understand exactly what I turned down. I also understand what I chose instead. I chose the opportunity to prove that companies can grow and prosper without compromising their values or abandoning their responsibilities to employees and communities. David leaned back in his chair, shaking his head. Your grandmother raised you well. Most people would have taken the money and run. Most people didn't inherit a company along with detailed instructions about maintaining its ethical standards, I replied. Eleanor left me more than just financial assets. She left me a responsibility to continue her vision for how business should be conducted. James Rodriguez pulled out his legal pad and began taking notes. If we're declining the buyout, we need to respond officially within the 48-hour deadline. I'll draft a formal rejection that leaves the door open for future discussions under different terms, just in case they're willing to modify their proposal. They won't modify it, Patricia said confidently. Cascade's entire business model depends on acquiring companies and then stripping away everything that doesn't contribute directly to short-term profits. They can't maintain their growth rate if they start accommodating target companies' values and employee priorities. Susan opened her laptop and began pulling up financial projections. If we're staying independent, we need to focus on sustainable growth strategies that don't require external investment. The educational partnerships Lauren proposed could be a good starting point, but we'll need to diversify our revenue streams to reduce dependence on any single client sector. For the next 2 hours, we transformed from a board considering a buyout offer into a strategic planning team focused on long-term growth and development. The energy in the room shifted from nervous anticipation to creative collaboration, with everyone contributing ideas about how to strengthen our market position while maintaining our ethical standards. I have a proposal, I said as the formal meeting wound down. Instead of just declining Cascade's offer, what if we use this opportunity to articulate publicly what kind of company we want to be? What if we release a statement explaining why we chose independence over immediate financial gain? Marcus looked skeptical. That could come across as sanctimonious or judgmental toward companies that do choose to sell. Not if we frame it correctly, I argued. We're not criticizing other people's choices. We're explaining our own values and inviting potential clients and employees who share those values to work with us. Patricia nodded slowly. It could actually be brilliant marketing. Instead of competing solely on technical capabilities or pricing, we'd be differentiating ourselves based on company culture and long-term reliability. Exactly. Clients who are tired of working with vendors that prioritize profits over relationships would see us as a viable alternative. Employees who want to work for companies that invest in their development would choose us over larger firms that treat them as replaceable resources. David was already drafting ideas on his notepad. We could even turn this into a case study for business schools, how a company chose sustainable growth over immediate liquidity and what the long-term results were. Now you're thinking like a marketer, I said, grinning. We're not just running a business. We're demonstrating an alternative approach to business that other companies could learn from. Thomas Bennett had been quiet throughout most of the discussion, but now he looked up from his legal documents. Lauren, there's one more thing you should consider. By declining this buyout publicly, you're essentially painting a target on your back for every struggling competitor who thinks they can manipulate or pressure you into future sales. What do you mean? Companies like Cascade don't usually accept rejection gracefully. They have teams of people whose job is to identify pressure points and create situations that force reconsideration. Your family situation has already demonstrated that you're vulnerable to certain types of manipulation. I thought about my mother's phone call the previous evening, her immediate assumption that family loyalty should translate into financial sharing. If she'd heard about the buyout offer so quickly, other people with less honorable intentions probably had as well. Are you suggesting that declining the offer could create additional safety or security concerns? I'm suggesting that becoming publicly known as someone who turned down $100 million for philosophical reasons makes you an interesting target for people who specialize in changing minds through various forms of persuasion. The sobering reality of Thomas's warning tempered my excitement about the decision I'd made. Choosing principles over profits was admirable in theory, but it could create practical complications that I hadn't fully considered. What kind of precautions should I be taking? Basic security measures for now: varying your routines, being aware of your surroundings, keeping your personal information private. If the publicity around our rejection generates significant attention, we can reassess and implement additional protections. As the meeting ended and everyone gathered their materials, I felt simultaneously exhilarated and apprehensive about the path I'd chosen. Declining the buyout offer felt morally right and strategically sound, but it also represented a commitment to navigate challenges that I couldn't yet fully envision. Patricia lingered after the others had left. Any second thoughts? None about the decision itself. But I'm starting to understand that choosing the difficult path doesn't just affect me. It affects everyone who works here, everyone who depends on us for services, and everyone who believes that businesses can operate ethically without sacrificing success. That's a lot of responsibility for someone who was looking for an entry-level marketing job just a few months ago. I laughed, recognizing the absurdity of my situation. I keep waiting for someone to tell me that this is all a mistake, that I'm not qualified to make these kinds of decisions. But then I remember that my grandmother trusted me with this responsibility, and she was an excellent judge of character. She was. And for what it's worth, I think you made the right choice. There are plenty of rich people in the world, but there aren't enough people willing to prioritize principle over profit when the stakes are this high. That afternoon, I worked with our communications team to draft a press release announcing our decision to remain independent. The statement was carefully worded to emphasize our commitment to sustainable growth and ethical business practices, without explicitly criticizing companies that made different choices. Meridian Tech's board of directors has unanimously decided to decline a recent acquisition offer in order to continue building our company as an independent organization committed to long-term value creation. The release began. While we appreciate the confidence this offer represented in our business model and growth potential, we believe our greatest opportunities lie in continued partnership with clients and employees who share our commitment to ethical innovation and community investment. The response was immediate and overwhelmingly positive. Within hours of the release going live, we received calls from potential clients who had been considering our services, from job candidates who wanted to work for a company that prioritized values over valuation, and from other business owners who were curious about our decision-making process. More unexpectedly, we received a call from a documentary filmmaker who wanted to explore our story as part of a larger project about alternative approaches to business growth and success measurement. The attention was flattering but also slightly overwhelming. I hadn't anticipated that declining a buyout offer would generate this level of public interest. My phone buzzed with a text from Brandon. Saw the news about Meridian Tech. Proud of you for sticking to your principles. That took real courage. It was the first supportive message I'd received from any family member since the will reading, and it meant more to me than I'd expected. Despite all the conflict and disappointment, part of me still hoped that my decisions might inspire positive changes in how we related to each other. That evening, I sat in my apartment reviewing the events of the day and planning for the challenges ahead. Declining the buyout offer had been the easy part. Now I had to prove that principled business practices could generate sustainable success without compromising financial viability. The phone rang as I was reviewing financial projections for the next quarter. Thomas Bennett's voice was tense and urgent. "Lauren? We have a problem. I just received a call from my contact at the courthouse. Your parents have filed a formal challenge to Eleanor's will, and they're requesting an emergency injunction to freeze all assets pending resolution of their claim." The words hit me like a physical blow. Can they do that? I thought you said their case was weak. Their legal case is weak, but the timing is strategically chosen. By filing right after your public rejection of the buyout offer, they're creating the impression that your decision was impulsive and potentially harmful to the estate's value. They're arguing that Eleanor's assets should be preserved until competency questions can be resolved. I sank into my kitchen chair, feeling the weight of family betrayal settle over me again. Just when I thought I'd found a path forward that honored my grandmother's legacy while building my own future, my parents had found a way to weaponize the legal system against me. Quote, "What happens next? Emergency hearing tomorrow morning. You'll need to be there, and you'll need to be prepared to defend both your grandmother's competency and your own decision-making process. This is about to become very public, very complicated, and very expensive." As I hung up the phone, I realized that the real test of my principles was just beginning. It was easy to choose ethics over money when the choice was theoretical. Now I was about to discover whether I could maintain that commitment when family members were actively trying to destroy everything I'd worked to build. The courthouse steps were slick with morning rain as I climbed toward what felt like the final battle for my professional and personal independence. Thomas Bennett walked beside me, his briefcase heavy with documentation that we hoped would prove my grandmother's mental competency and my own decision-making authority. Behind us, a small group of reporters had gathered, drawn by the unusual story of a young woman fighting her own family for control of a tech company inheritance. "Remember," Thomas said quietly as we approached the entrance, "today isn't about defending your business decisions. It's about demonstrating that Eleanor was fully competent when she made her will, and that her choices should be respected, regardless of their financial implications." Inside the courthouse, the atmosphere was formal and charged with tension. My parents sat at the plaintiff's table with their attorney, a sharp-featured woman in an expensive suit who specialized in estate challenges. They didn't look at me as I took my seat, but I could sense their nervous energy from across the aisle. Judge Margaret Sullivan entered the courtroom with the brisk efficiency of someone who had presided over hundreds of similar disputes. She was known for her no-nonsense approach to family conflicts and her impatience with legal strategies that prioritize drama over substance. "This is an emergency hearing regarding the estate of Eleanor Margaret Hayes," Judge Sullivan announced. "The petitioners are requesting an injunction to freeze estate assets pending resolution of their competency challenge. Mr. Davidson, please present your case." My parents' attorney stood smoothly, radiating the confidence of someone who had successfully manipulated family dynamics in courtrooms for decades. "Your Honor, we're here because Richard and Victoria Hayes are deeply concerned about their daughter's impulsive and potentially destructive management of valuable family assets." She gestured toward a stack of documents on her table. "Yesterday, Ms. Hayes rejected a buyout offer worth over $200 million, apparently without consulting other family members or considering the long-term implications for the estate. This decision raises serious questions about her judgment and her fitness to manage assets that rightfully belong to the entire Hayes family." I felt my jaw clench at her deliberate mischaracterization of both my decision-making process and my legal authority, but Thomas had warned me to remain calm and let him respond to their arguments. "Furthermore," the attorney continued, "we have evidence suggesting that Eleanor Hayes was suffering from cognitive decline in the months before her death, making her vulnerable to manipulation by individuals who stood to benefit from changes to her estate plan." Thomas rose to respond, his voice steady and confident. "Your Honor, these allegations are not only false but deliberately misleading. Mrs. Hayes underwent comprehensive medical evaluations by 3 independent physicians in the 6 months before her death, all of whom certified her mental competency. We have those medical records, and we're prepared to present them as evidence." He walked to our table and picked up a thick folder. "We also have detailed documentation of Mrs. Hayes's investment decisions over the past decade, demonstrating consistent strategic thinking and careful financial planning. Her decision to leave controlling interest in Meridian Tech to her granddaughter wasn't impulsive. It was the culmination of years of observation and evaluation." Judge Sullivan looked between the two attorneys. "Mr. Davidson, what specific evidence do you have of cognitive impairment?" "My parents," attorney hesitated slightly. "We have statements from family members indicating changes in Mrs. Hayes's behavior and decision-making patterns. She became increasingly secretive about her finances and began making comments suggesting distrust of long-standing family relationships." "Hearsay and speculation," Thomas interjected. "Your Honor, distrust of family members who subsequently proved willing to sabotage their own daughter's career prospects might indicate excellent judgment rather than cognitive impairment." Judge Sullivan raised an eyebrow. "Elaborate on that statement, Mr. Bennett." Thomas opened another folder. "Ms. Hayes recently applied for a position at Meridian Tech. During the interview process, her parents contacted the company and made false allegations about her character and criminal history, deliberately sabotaging her employment prospects to protect their own competing business interests." The courtroom was completely silent as Thomas distributed copies of David Chen's sworn affidavit describing the phone call from my parents. This documented behavior suggests that Mrs. Hayes had excellent reasons for questioning whether traditional family inheritance patterns would serve her granddaughter's best interests. My mother shifted uncomfortably in her seat, finally understanding that their sabotage of my interview would become part of the public record through this legal challenge. Your Honor, my parents, attorney said, her confidence wavering. Family disputes don't invalidate legitimate concerns about asset management. Ms. Hayes' rejection of a substantial buyout offer demonstrates poor business judgment that could harm the estate's value. Judge Sullivan leaned forward. Ms. Hayes, please stand and explain your reasoning for declining this buyout offer. I rose, feeling the weight of everyone's attention, but also the clarity that came from knowing I'd made the right decision. Your Honor, I declined the offer because accepting it would have required dismantling everything my grandmother valued about Meridian Tech. The acquiring company wanted to terminate employees, eliminate community partnerships, and abandon the ethical business practices that made the company worth acquiring in the first place. And you believe your grandmother would have disapproved of the sale? I don't believe it, Your Honor. I know it. She left detailed written instructions about her expectations for how the company should be managed, emphasizing ethical standards and long-term value creation over short-term profits. Accepting that buyout offer would have violated every principle she asked me to uphold. Judge Sullivan reviewed the documents Thomas had submitted. I see that Mrs. Hayes also left a personal letter for Ms. Hayes explaining her reasoning for the inheritance structure. Mr. Bennett, please read the relevant sections aloud. Thomas stood and opened my grandmother's letter. She wrote, Meridian Tech represents the future of ethical business practices. I am leaving this responsibility to you because I trust you to uphold these values, even when it means confronting those who have wronged you. The people who sabotaged your interview made a tactical error. They assumed that destroying your opportunity would eliminate the threat you represented to their comfortable mediocrity. They never imagined that you might return as their superior, armed with the power to demand the ethical standards they refused to maintain. The words hung in the courtroom air like an indictment. My grandmother had not only anticipated this legal challenge, she had provided the moral and legal framework for responding to it. Judge Sullivan closed the folder and looked directly at my parents. It appears that Mrs. Hayes was not only mentally competent, but remarkably prescient about family dynamics and business ethics. Mr. and Mrs. Hayes, did you in fact contact Meridian Tech to make false allegations about your daughter's background? My father finally spoke, his voice barely audible. We were concerned about her rushing into a position she might not be ready for. That's not what I asked. Did you make false allegations about criminal activity? The silence stretched uncomfortably before my mother answered. We may have expressed concerns that were overstated. You made false allegations to sabotage your daughter's employment prospects, Judge Sullivan stated flatly. This court finds that Mrs. Eleanor Hayes had excellent judgment in questioning whether such individuals should benefit from her estate or influence her granddaughter's inheritance. She turned to my parents' attorney. Ms. Davidson, do you have any evidence of actual cognitive impairment beyond speculation about family relationship changes? Your Honor, we believe the medical records should be reviewed independently to verify. The medical records have been reviewed independently by 3 physicians, all of whom certified Mrs. Hayes' competency. Judge Sullivan's patience was clearly exhausted. This appears to be a frivolous challenge motivated by financial disappointment rather than legitimate concerns about testamentary capacity. Thomas stepped forward. Your Honor, we respectfully request that this challenge be dismissed with prejudice and that the petitioners be required to pay all legal costs associated with defending against their unfounded allegations. Judge Sullivan nodded. The request for an emergency injunction is denied. The competency challenge is dismissed with prejudice. The petitioners will be responsible for all legal costs incurred by the defendant in responding to this action. She looked directly at my parents. I strongly advise you to reconsider any future legal challenges to this estate. The evidence suggests that your mother made thoughtful, well-informed decisions about her assets based on careful observation of family behavior over many years. Further attempts to overturn her clearly expressed wishes could result in sanctions against you and your counsel. As the gavel fell, I felt a profound sense of relief mixed with sadness. The legal challenge was over, but the family relationships it had exposed were probably beyond repair. My parents had gambled everything on their ability to manipulate the legal system, and they had lost decisively. Outside the courthouse, reporters approached us for comments, but Thomas guided me quickly to his car. "No statements today," he told them firmly. "The court records speak for themselves." During the drive back to my office, I processed what had just occurred. The legal victory was complete and public, establishing my authority over Meridian Tech while exposing my parents' unethical behavior to anyone who cared to examine the court records. "How do you feel?" Thomas asked as we pulled into the Meridian Tech parking garage. "Exhausted," I replied honestly, "but also free. For the first time in my adult life, I don't have to worry about my family undermining my decisions or questioning my judgment. They've shown who they really are, and everyone can see it. Your grandmother would be proud. She trusted you to handle this responsibility with integrity, and you've proven her judgment was sound." The next few weeks passed in a blur of positive developments. The media coverage of our court victory and our decision to reject the buyout offer attracted attention from clients who valued ethical business practices. Our educational partnership program launched successfully, with 3 universities signing contracts for technology consulting services. Most significantly, we received inquiries from several talented professionals who wanted to work for a company that prioritized values over purely financial metrics. One morning, Patricia knocked on my office door with an expression I couldn't quite read. "Lauren, we have an interesting situation developing. Do you have a few minutes?" She settled into the chair across from my desk and opened a folder. "We've received a formal request for partnership discussions from a company called Cascade Industries." I looked up sharply. The same Cascade Industries that wanted to buy us out? The very same. Apparently, our public rejection of their acquisition offer and the subsequent media coverage generated significant interest from their existing clients. Several Fortune 500 companies have contacted them asking if they could work with Meridian Tech as a subcontractor on major projects. So they want to partner with us instead of acquiring us? It's more complex than that. They're proposing a strategic alliance where we would handle community-focused projects and employee development initiatives for their corporate clients, while they would manage the large-scale technical implementations. It would give us access to much bigger contracts while allowing us to maintain our independence and our values. I leaned back in my chair, considering the irony. They're essentially asking us to do the work they wanted to eliminate when they tried to buy us. Exactly. It turns out that some of their clients specifically requested the kind of ethical oversight and community engagement that we specialize in. Rejecting their buyout offer didn't hurt us financially. It created a market niche that only we can fill. The partnership discussions continued over several months, ultimately resulting in a collaboration that benefited both companies while preserving our autonomy. Cascade Industries gained access to expertise they couldn't develop internally, while we gained access to resources and client relationships that accelerated our growth beyond what we could have achieved independently. More importantly, our success began attracting attention from other business leaders who were interested in demonstrating that ethical practices and financial success weren't mutually exclusive. We received speaking invitations, consulting requests, and partnership proposals from organizations across multiple industries. 6 months after the court victory, I stood before a group of business school students at Portland State University, delivering a lecture about ethical leadership and sustainable business practices. The irony wasn't lost on me. I was speaking at the same university where I'd completed my MBA while struggling to find entry-level employment in my chosen field. The most important lesson I've learned, I told the students, is that ethical business practices aren't a luxury for companies that can afford to prioritize principles over profits. They're a competitive advantage for organizations that want to build lasting relationships with clients, employees, and communities. A student in the front row raised her hand. But what about situations where doing the right thing costs money in the short term? How do you convince investors or board members to support decisions that might reduce immediate returns? I thought about my decision to reject the Cascade buyout offer, about the fear and uncertainty I'd felt when choosing principles over guaranteed financial security. You demonstrate that long-term thinking produces better results than short-term optimization, I replied. When you build a company culture based on trust and ethical practices, you attract clients who value reliability over convenience, employees who contribute creativity and loyalty, and partners who are invested in mutual success rather than one-sided extraction. After the lecture, I walked across campus to the building where I'd spent countless hours studying business theory and dreaming about opportunities to apply what I was learning. The environment looked the same, but I felt like a completely different person than the uncertain graduate student who had worried about finding a job that would value her skills and potential. My phone buzzed with a text from Aunt Carol. Saw the article about your university lecture in the Business Journal. Eleanor would be so proud of everything you've built. That evening, I sat in my apartment, the same modest one-bedroom space I'd occupied during my job search, though I could now afford something much larger, reviewing reports from our various departments. The Educational Partnership Program had expanded to include community colleges and trade schools. Our corporate consulting practice had grown to include sustainability initiatives and workplace ethics training. Most meaningfully, our employee satisfaction surveys consistently showed that people genuinely enjoyed working for Meridian Tech and felt proud of the company's reputation. The doorbell rang around 7 o'clock, which surprised me since I wasn't expecting anyone. Through the peephole, I saw Brandon standing in the hallway, holding what appeared to be a bottle of wine and looking nervous. I opened the door cautiously. "This is unexpected." "I know we haven't talked much since the court hearing," he said. "I brought a peace offering and hoped we could have a conversation." I let him in, curious about what had prompted this visit. We sat in my living room, and he placed the wine bottle on the coffee table without opening it. "Lauren, I want to apologize. Not just for the interview sabotage, but for 28 years of being complicit in the way our parents treated you differently. I benefited from their favoritism, and I told myself that acknowledging it would just make things worse for everyone. What changed your mind?" Brandon ran his hands through his hair, a gesture I remembered from childhood when he was struggling with difficult emotions. The court hearing, sitting there and listening to the judge describe their behavior, seeing it laid out in legal documents and witness statements. I couldn't pretend anymore that it was just family dysfunction. It was systematic undermining of your opportunities, and I participated by staying silent. And I realized that my silence wasn't protecting anyone. It was just protecting my own comfort and my own position in the family hierarchy. He looked directly at me for the first time since arriving. Quote, "I don't expect forgiveness, and I'm not asking for anything from you. I just wanted you to know that I see what happened clearly now, and I'm ashamed of my part in it." We talked for 2 hours, covering memories and family dynamics that we'd never discussed honestly before. Brandon acknowledged specific instances where he'd received opportunities that I'd been denied, where our parents had invested in his interests while dismissing mine, where my achievements had been minimized while his had been celebrated. "What's going to happen with you and Mom and Dad?" I asked. "I don't know. They're struggling financially and emotionally." The legal costs from the will challenge were significant, and they lost several clients after the court proceedings became public. "They keep expecting me to intercede with you on their behalf, but I've told them that I can't and won't do that." "How do you feel about that?" "Relieved, honestly. For the first time in my life, I'm making decisions based on what I think is right, rather than what keeps everyone else comfortable. It's terrifying but also liberating." When Brandon left that evening, I felt something I hadn't expected: hope for the possibility of genuine family relationships based on honesty rather than manipulation. Not reconciliation with my parents, who had shown no willingness to acknowledge their behavior, but authentic connection with at least one family member who was capable of growth and accountability. A year after inheriting Meridian Tech, I stood in the conference room where I'd been publicly rejected during my job interview, addressing a gathering of employees, clients, and community partners who had come to celebrate our company's expansion and success. The irony of the location wasn't lost on anyone present. Several people had specifically mentioned the symbolic importance of hosting our celebration in the same space where my journey had begun. When I first walked into this room, I told the assembled group, I was hoping to convince strangers that I deserved a chance to prove myself. Today I'm surrounded by colleagues and partners who know that everyone deserves opportunities to contribute their talents and perspectives to meaningful work. David Chen, who had conducted my original interview, approached me after the formal presentation. "Lauren, I owe you an apology. Even after we learned that the allegations about your background were false, I let my concerns about family drama influence my perception of your qualifications. I should have recognized your potential regardless of external complications. You were protecting the company from what appeared to be a problematic situation, I replied. But I'm grateful that you were willing to reconsider your assessment once you had complete information. It's more than that. Watching how you've handled ownership of this company, how you've balanced business growth with ethical considerations, it's changed my understanding of what leadership looks like. You've proven that integrity and success aren't competing priorities. As the celebration continued around us, I found myself thinking about my grandmother's letter and her prediction that I would return as the superior of those who had wronged me. The prediction had been accurate, but the reality was more complex than simple reversal of power dynamics. I hadn't just gained authority over people who had mistreated me. I'd learned to use that authority to create environments where such mistreatment couldn't occur. Late that evening, after the last guests had departed and the catering team had cleaned up, I stood alone in the empty conference room, looking out at the Portland skyline. The city lights reflected off the river, creating patterns that shifted with the water's movement. Everything was constantly changing, but the underlying current remained steady and strong. My phone rang with a call from Thomas Bennett. "Lauren, I wanted to give you an update on your parents' situation. They've reached out through their attorney asking if you might be willing to discuss a settlement agreement." "What kind of settlement?" "They're offering to permanently drop any claims against Eleanor's estate in exchange for a modest financial settlement that would help them avoid bankruptcy. They're also proposing to sign non-disclosure agreements about family matters and business disputes." I considered the offer carefully. A settlement would provide closure and prevent future legal challenges, but it would also reward their behavior with financial compensation they hadn't earned. "What's your professional recommendation?" Quote, "From a legal standpoint, you don't need to settle. Their claims were dismissed with prejudice, and they're facing significant financial pressure from legal costs and lost business. From a practical standpoint, a settlement might provide peace of mind and finality. And from an ethical standpoint?" Thomas was quiet for a moment. "That's not a legal question, Lauren. That's a personal decision about what kind of relationship you want with your family going forward." I thought about my grandmother's emphasis on using power wisely but decisively. Eleanor had trusted me to make difficult choices that upheld important principles while also recognizing the human costs of those choices. "I'll provide a small settlement," I decided, not because they deserve it, but because completely destroying them wouldn't serve any constructive purpose. "But I want the non-disclosure agreement to be mutual. They don't discuss family matters publicly, and I don't discuss their business practices beyond what's already in the court record." That's a generous and mature approach. It's a strategic approach. I'm not interested in ongoing conflict, but I'm also not interested in pretending that their behavior was acceptable. The settlement acknowledges reality without rewarding their choices. 2 years after the will reading that had changed my life, I sat in the boardroom of our expanded headquarters, reviewing quarterly reports that showed consistent growth in revenue, employee satisfaction, and community impact. Meridian Tech had become a case study in business schools across the country, demonstrating how ethical practices could drive both financial success and positive social outcomes. More personally, I had developed into the kind of leader I dreamed of working for during my frustrating job search. Someone who made decisions based on clear principles, who invested in employee development, who treated business relationships as partnerships rather than transactions. The settlement with my parents had been finalized 6 months earlier, providing them with enough financial support to avoid bankruptcy while establishing clear boundaries for future interactions. We exchanged holiday cards and maintained polite contact, but the deeper family relationship I'd once hoped for had been permanently altered by their choices. Brandon had become a genuine friend, someone I could trust to be honest about difficult topics, and who had demonstrated his commitment to growth and accountability through his actions rather than just his words. He'd left Hayes & Associates to start his own consulting practice, focusing on helping family businesses navigate succession planning and conflict resolution. Ironic career choice. I'd teased him when he told me about his new focus. Deliberate career choice, he'd replied. I want to help other families avoid the mistakes ours made. As I reviewed the day's reports, my assistant knocked on my office door. Lauren, there's someone here to see you. She doesn't have an appointment, But she says it's about a job application. Send her in. A young woman in her mid-20s entered my office, wearing a professional suit that looked like it had been carefully chosen for an important meeting. She carried herself with the nervous confidence of someone who had prepared extensively for an opportunity she desperately wanted. Ms. Hayes, thank you for seeing me. My name is Jessica Park, and I'm a recent MBA graduate from Portland State. I've been following Meridian Tech's growth and your approach to ethical business practices. I'm hoping you might consider me for a position in your marketing department. I gestured for her to take a seat, noting the careful way she arranged her portfolio and the respectful attention she gave to the office environment. Tell me about your background, Jessica. I completed my MBA while working part-time to support myself through school. My undergraduate degree was in communications, and I've done internships with several local nonprofits focusing on community outreach and digital marketing. I'm particularly interested in the way Meridian Tech integrates social responsibility with business strategy. As she spoke, I saw echoes of my younger self. The earnest preparation, the genuine enthusiasm for meaningful work, the hope that someone would recognize her potential and provide an opportunity to prove herself. Patricia was already taking notes. It also positions us as a company that cares about social impact, not just profits. That kind of reputation attracts both clients and employees who share those values. Exactly, I agreed. And it demonstrates our commitment to the kind of ethical business practices we've been discussing. We're not just talking about integrity, we're actively investing in community development. The afternoon session flew by as we developed the education partnership concept into a concrete proposal. I found myself contributing ideas and insights that drew on my academic background, my research into industry trends, and my understanding of how different organizational cultures approached innovation. For the first time in my professional life, I felt like my voice was not just heard but valued. As the meeting wrapped up, James Rodriguez approached me with a thoughtful expression. Lauren, can I ask you something? How are you handling the emotional aspects of this transition? It's gotta be complicated, moving from family conflict to business leadership in such a short time frame. I considered his question carefully. It's definitely complex, but in some ways, the professional challenges are easier to navigate than the family dynamics were. Here, decisions are made based on clear criteria and measurable outcomes. With my family, everything was subjective and constantly changing based on their emotional needs or business interests. Have you heard from them since your meeting on Saturday? Radio silence, which is probably for the best right now. I need time to establish my identity in this role without constantly defending my decisions to people who have never respected my judgment anyway. James nodded understandingly. One piece of advice, if you're open to it, document everything. Not just for legal protection, but for your own clarity. When you're dealing with people who have a history of gaslighting and manipulation, written records become crucial for maintaining perspective. His advice resonated deeply. My parents had spent years convincing me that my perceptions were wrong, that my emotional reactions were overblown, that their treatment of me was normal and justified. Having clear documentation of events and decisions would help me maintain confidence in my own judgment. That evening, I returned to my apartment and began implementing James's suggestion. I created a detailed record of every significant interaction since the will reading, including the board meeting discussions, my family's reactions to the new business policies, and my own emotional responses to each development. The act of writing everything down helped me process the magnitude of the changes in my life, while also creating a reference point for future decisions. My phone buzzed with a text from Aunt Carol. How did your first board meeting go? Are you feeling more confident about your new role? I called her instead of texting back, wanting to share the excitement I felt about the day's accomplishments. Carol, it was incredible. I presented the integrity framework to the board, and they didn't just accept it, they helped me improve it. They treated my ideas like they had real value. Because they do have real value, Carol replied warmly. You've spent years developing skills and perspectives that your parents refused to acknowledge. Now you're finally in an environment where those abilities can be recognized and utilized. There's something else, I continued. We started developing a new initiative to partner with educational institutions. It was my idea, and the board was genuinely enthusiastic about it. I feel like I'm actually contributing to something meaningful instead of just hoping someone will give me a chance to prove myself. That's wonderful, Lauren. Eleanor would be so proud to see you taking ownership of your talents instead of apologizing for them. After we hung up, I sat at my kitchen table with my laptop open, researching everything I could find about successful educational partnerships in the technology consulting industry. This wasn't homework assigned by someone else. It was self-directed learning driven by my own enthusiasm for a project I'd helped create. The difference in my motivation level was remarkable. Tuesday morning brought my first crisis as a board member. I arrived at the office to find Patricia waiting for me with a grim expression and a folder full of documents. "We have a problem," she said without preamble. Not just because of changed circumstances, but because of changed perspective. I had learned that my worth wasn't dependent on other people's recognition, that my potential wasn't limited by other people's insecurities, and that my future wasn't constrained by other people's attempts to control it. Sometimes the greatest gift comes disguised as the greatest betrayal. My parents' sabotage had led to my grandmother's intervention, which had led to opportunities I never could have imagined when I was simply hoping for an entry-level marketing position. Their attempt to diminish me had ultimately created the circumstances that allowed me to flourish beyond their ability to undermine. As I drove home through the Portland evening, I felt profound gratitude for the journey that had brought me to this point. Not gratitude for the pain or the betrayal, but gratitude for the strength I'd discovered in myself, for the principles that had guided me through difficult decisions, and for the opportunity to build something meaningful from the ashes of family dysfunction. The future stretched ahead, full of challenges and opportunities I couldn't yet envision. But whatever came next, I would face it as someone who had proven to herself that integrity and success weren't competing values, that ethical leadership could drive business growth, and that the best revenge against those who try to diminish you is becoming everything they said you couldn't be. The small badge that little boy had made for me during the Literacy Center opening still sat on my desk, a handmade reminder that true worth came from contribution rather than recognition, from lifting others up rather than protecting yourself from competition. Every day it reminded me that the most important part of success wasn't what you gained for yourself, but what you made possible for others. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities, and new chances to demonstrate that business could be a force for positive change when guided by principled leadership. Tonight, I was simply grateful for the journey that had brought me home to myself. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.